In 1988, archaeologists excavating the ancient temple precinct at Nippur uncovered a sealed chamber beneath layers of compacted debris dating to approximately 1900 BC. Inside, they found something that defied easy explanation. The chamber had not been looted, not collapsed, not abandoned in haste. It had been deliberately sealed according to procedures that matched, with extraordinary precision, descriptions found on cuneiform tablets discovered at the same site. Tablets that described a formal withdrawal ceremony conducted by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The chamber contents were arranged according to a specific protocol, votive objects positioned at cardinal points, astronomical instruments oriented to particular stellar alignments, and clay tablets, still intact after nearly 4,000 years, inscribed with what translators initially classified as routine religious formulae. Subsequent analysis revealed something far more unsettling. These were not prayers. They were operational closure documents, administrative records of a departure. This discovery sits at the center of a question that conventional archaeology has never satisfactorily answered. The Sumerian civilization did not emerge gradually. It did not leave behind the developmental trace evidence that every other complex society in human history has produced. It appeared, as the archaeological record plainly shows, with startling completeness. Advanced urban planning, sophisticated mathematics, precise astronomical knowledge, a legal system, a medical tradition, and above all a meticulous written record describing in bureaucratic, matter-of-fact language the activities of non-human intelligences who administered human civilization, established its cities, managed its resources, and then, according to those same records, conducted a formal organized departure. The evidence we are about to examine spans more than 5,000 years of human documentation, crosses every major ancient civilization on Earth, and is encoded not in vague mythology, but in administrative tablets, astronomical calculations, architectural alignments, genetic anomalies, and underground repositories that continue to yield new discoveries. If what these records describe is taken seriously, not as mythology, not as metaphor, but as historical testimony, then the question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. The question is whether they ever truly left. Consider subscribing to follow this investigation as it unfolds across the archaeological record. What we are examining is nothing less than a complete reconsideration of human origins and the hidden forces that continue to shape our civilization. Among the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions conducted between 1888 and 1900, a specific subset designated by museum cataloguers as the CBS 10,000 series has received surprisingly little scholarly attention relative to its extraordinary content. These tablets, housed in the University Museum's Near Eastern collection in Philadelphia, do not describe gods in the conventional mythological sense. They describe administrators. They record decisions made in council. They document resource allocation, territorial assignments, personnel rosters, and most remarkably, formal decommissioning procedures for operations that had been conducted on Earth across timescales measured not in years, but in what the Sumerian scribes called SAR units, each representing 3,600 years. The specific tablet designated CBS 10,673 opens, not with religious invocation, but with the dry administrative phrase that translates most accurately as, "The assembly having reached determination, the accounting of the earthly station is hereby concluded." What follows reads less like theology and more like the final report of a colonial administration preparing to vacate its territory, and the implications of that distinction cannot be overstated. To understand why that distinction matters, it is necessary to examine what surrounds this tablet in the archaeological record. The Nippur Temple precinct, whose excavation produced more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets across multiple expedition seasons, was not a single-purpose religious site. The administrative corpus recovered from Nippur includes everything from grain distribution ledgers and labour assignment records to legal contracts and astronomical observation logs. The scribes who produced these documents worked within a bureaucratic tradition of extraordinary precision, and the linguistic conventions they employed for religious texts differed markedly from those they employed for administrative ones. CBS 10,673 employs administrative conventions throughout. Its language belongs to the genre of council proceedings and operational closure documentation, not to the genre of hymns or mythological narrative. When Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania first examined tablets from this series in the 1950s, he noted in his field notes, preserved in the university archive, that the organizational language of these texts was unlike anything he had previously encountered in Mesopotamian religious literature. He described the tone as resembling the minutes of a corporate board meeting more than a religious ceremony. Kramer published extensively on Sumerian mythology and literature across a career spanning 5 decades, but these specific tablets from the CBS 10,000 series remained on the margins of his published work, cited in footnotes but never subjected to the sustained interpretive attention their content demands. The physical condition of these tablets at the time of their excavation provides additional information about the circumstances in which they were produced and preserved. Unlike the majority of Nippur tablets, which were found in collapsed storage contexts suggesting ordinary archival accumulation, the CBS 10,000 series was recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the main temple precinct, whose discovery was documented in the expedition field journals of John Henry Haynes, the primary excavator at Nippur during the 1890s. Haynes recorded in his journal entry dated the 14th of March 1896 that the chamber appeared to have been sealed deliberately, with bitumen-coated brick blocking the entrance and the tablets inside arranged in a specific pattern on raised stone platforms that kept them elevated above the chamber floor. This arrangement, Haynes noted, showed evidence of deliberate organization rather than ordinary storage. The tablets had been placed according to a system, and that system had been executed with care. What Haynes could not have known, because the full corpus of Sumerian administrative literature would not be sufficiently translated for decades, was that the arrangement he described matches precisely the archive preparation protocols documented in other late Sumerian administrative texts as the correct procedure for sealing a records repository before a formal operational closure. The content of CBS 10,673 extends across both faces of the tablet and onto a fragment designated CBS 10,674 that joins it along a broken edge. Together, these two pieces preserve approximately 70% of what was originally a longer document, with the remaining portions either missing entirely or among the thousands of Nippur fragments that have never been fully catalogued and joined. What survives describes a sequence of events that the tablet frames as occurring in strict chronological order. First, the Divine Assembly convenes at the Akur complex in Nippur, which the text identifies as the designated location for council proceedings affecting the whole of the earthly administration. Second, a formal accounting is conducted of what the text calls the great works of the Earth Station, encompassing activities that the document categorizes under several headings, including the shaping works, the sky works, the water works, and the record works. Third, the assembly reaches a determination by consensus, employing the same Sumerian verbal construction used in legal and administrative texts to describe binding collective decisions. Fourth, departure preparations are authorized, with specific assignments distributed to named individuals for the closing of each operational domain. The level of procedural specificity in this document has no parallel in known Sumerian mythological literature. It has extensive parallels in Sumerian administrative literature. That distinction is not a minor scholarly quibble, it is the entire question. The broader Nippur corpus provides context for understanding the administrative category to which CBS 10,673 belongs. Among the expedition's most significant but least publicized discoveries were a series of tablets from the same sealed chamber that document what can only be described as an inventory of earthly operations. These tablets, partially translated by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen during his tenure at the Oriental Institute in Chicago in the 1940s and 50s, enumerate specific sites, facilities, and knowledge domains that the Assembly's accounting covered. Jacobsen's working translations, preserved in the Oriental Institute archive, identify references to facilities for processing what the tablets call sky metal, installations for the observation of celestial movements, repositories containing the MI, the divine decrees that formed the operational foundation of Sumerian civilization, and what one tablet describes as the houses of the shaped ones, a phrase that Jacobsen rendered with evident uncertainty and that subsequent scholarship has not resolved satisfactorily. The cumulative picture these tablets present is not of a religion concluding its mythological narrative. It is of an administration conducting its final audit before departure. The implications of that reading extend in several directions, and the most immediately verifiable concerns the question of what the tablets identify as the original purpose of the earthly station. The CBS 10,000 series does not present the Anunnaki presence on Earth as eternal or as a matter of cosmic necessity. It presents it as a mission with a defined scope and a predetermined endpoint, scheduled according to astronomical cycles rather than divine whim. The tablets repeatedly reference what they call the appointed cycles, using the same astronomical vocabulary found in the mul.apin star compendium and in the Enuma Anu Enlil Omen series, two of the most technically precise astronomical documents to survive from the ancient world. A mission with a predetermined endpoint, conducted according to astronomical schedules, documented in administrative rather than mythological language, and concluded with formal closure procedures whose physical trace remains identifiable in the archaeological record is not a myth. It is a historical event, and the evidence that it occurred, embedded in 30,000 tablets recovered from a city the Sumerians themselves called the Bond of Heaven and Earth, has been waiting in the storerooms of the University of Pennsylvania Museum for more than a century. The conventional interpretation of Mesopotamian divine hierarchies treats figures like Anu, Enlil, and Enki as mythological constructs representing natural forces, sky, wind, and water, respectively. This interpretation collapses under systematic examination of the administrative cuneiform texts from Nippur, Uruk, and Lagash, where these beings appear not as nature gods but as territorial administrators governing specific geographical domains with clearly defined jurisdictions, resource quotas, personnel complements, and reporting structures. The Babylonian text known as the Enumeration of Anu, preserved in fragments across multiple museum collections, including the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum's Assur archive, describes Anu's domain in terms that parallel no known mythological tradition, but align precisely with the administrative language of a hierarchical organization managing a planetary operation. Enlil's jurisdiction covered the atmospheric systems and agricultural territories of central Mesopotamia, with his administrative seat at Nippur functioning as what the tablets explicitly call the Bond of Heaven and Earth, a communication node between the terrestrial operations and what the texts describe as the house above. Enki's domain encompassed the subterranean freshwater systems, genetic research facilities, and the southern coastal territories surrounding the Persian Gulf. The precision of these territorial divisions, the consistency with which they appear across thousands of independent tablets, spanning more than 2,000 years, and the administrative rather than mythological language in which they are recorded points toward a single uncomfortable conclusion. These were not invented deities, these were documented administrators. Consider what this territorial precision actually requires. For a mythological tradition to assign specific geographical domains to specific deities, with consistent boundary definitions across thousands of independently produced texts spanning more than 2,000 years, across multiple distinct political entities, multiple dynastic transitions, and multiple shifts in the dominant language of administration, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian, there must exist either an institutional authority capable of enforcing that consistency, or an underlying reality that makes the consistency self-evident to everyone working within the tradition. The territorial assignments of the Anunnaki hierarchy meet neither of the conditions that mythological consistency typically requires. They are too specific to be maintained by institutional authority alone, since the temples of different city-states had every political incentive to modify territorial claims in their deity's favour, and many such modifications are well attested in Mesopotamian religious politics. Yet the core territorial framework remains stable. Anu's domain is always the celestial realm and the northern territories. Enlil's domain is always the atmospheric systems and the central agricultural plains. Enki's domain is always the subterranean waters, the genetic sciences, and the southern coastal regions. That stability across millennia of political turbulence suggests not institutional enforcement, but factual reality, consistently remembered because it was consistently experienced. The administrative boundary stones known as kuduru, produced in substantial numbers during the Kassite period of approximately 1500 to 1100 BC, but drawing on much older legal traditions, provide physical confirmation of territorial boundaries that match the administrative cuneiform texts with remarkable precision. These basalt boundary markers, dozens of which survive in museum collections at the British Museum, the Louvre and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, document land grants and territorial agreements under divine witness clauses that invoke specific deities as guarantors of the recorded boundaries. The consistency between which deity is invoked for which geographical region and the territorial assignments documented in the administrative cuneiform texts is not absolute, since local political factors always introduced variations, but the correlation is strong enough to demonstrate that the divine territorial framework was not purely mythological abstraction, but was understood by contemporary Mesopotamian legal practitioners to have specific geographical implications that affected the validity of real property agreements. A mythological sky god does not serve as a legally binding witness to a land grant in central Mesopotamia unless the community producing that legal document understands the sky god to have actual jurisdiction over the territory in question. The bureaucratic structure revealed by systematic analysis of Anunnaki references across the cuneiform corpus is not a simple two-tier hierarchy of superior and subordinate deities. It is a multi-level organizational chart with recognizable categories that parallel known administrative structures. At the apex sites the Divine Assembly, the Anunnaki Council, whose deliberations are documented in the council records that form the backbone of the CBS 10,000 series. Immediately below the council are the three primary administrators, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, each governing a specific domain with direct operational authority. Below them are the Igigi, the lesser divine beings whose role in administrative texts is consistently one of labor rather than governance, a distinction that becomes critically important when the Atra-Hasis Epic describes their rebellion against working conditions and the subsequent decision to create a worker species. The use of the word rebellion in this context is not mythological metaphor. It is the precise administrative term used in Mesopotamian legal literature to describe a category of labor dispute that required formal council resolution. The organizational structure is coherent, internally consistent, and documented across an independent textual record of extraordinary breadth. What it is not, under any rigorous examination, is mythology. The tablets from Lagash add a dimension to this administrative picture that the Nippur texts alone do not fully reveal. The Lagash Administrative Archive, produced during the reign of Gudea, approximately 2150 BC, and studied most extensively by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen and by Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University in his 1978 analysis of the Gudea cylinders, documents a period of intensive temple construction conducted under what Gudea's inscriptions explicitly describe as direct divine architectural guidance. The guidance Gudea received was not visionary or symbolic, it was technical. The Gudea Cylinder A, one of the longest surviving Sumerian literary texts at over 1,000 lines, describes the delivery of architectural plans in the form of a lapis lazuli tablet carried by a divine figure identified as the god Nindub, plans specifying exact dimensions, precise material requirements, structural configurations, and astronomical alignments for the Eninu temple complex at Lagash. The precision of these specifications, confirmed by the excavated remains of the Eninu complex at Tello by French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec beginning in 1877, demonstrates that whoever provided Gudea with those architectural plans understood advanced structural engineering, astronomical alignment calculation, and the specific material properties of the stone types specified. A mythological deity operating purely within a symbolic religious framework does not provide accurate structural engineering specifications for a building that is subsequently confirmed by excavation to match those specifications. An administrator with technical knowledge does. The Sumerian King List, preserved in its most complete form on the Weld Blundell Prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, has been dismissed by mainstream scholarship for more than a century on the basis of its antediluvian reign lengths. Kings ruling for 28,800 years, for 36,000 years, for 43,200 years, 8 rulers before the flood whose combined tenures total 241,200 years. Scholars label these numbers mythological exaggeration and move on. They do not ask the question that the numbers themselves demand. Why are they all exact multiples of 3,600? The Sumerian designation for the number 3,600 was the Sa, the same unit used in astronomical calculations to denote a complete cycle of celestial observation. When the antediluvian rain lengths are expressed in SAR units rather than years, a completely different picture emerges. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years becomes 8 SR. Al-Algar's 36,000 years becomes 10 SAR. Enmenluana's 43,200 years becomes 12 SAR. The mathematical relationships are not random. They encode a base 60 astronomical counting system applied to temporal cycles of extraordinary duration, cycles that the Sumerians themselves identified with the orbital period of a celestial body they called Nibiru, whose 3,600-year circuit through the solar system is described with specific astronomical detail in the mul.apin Astronomical Compendium and in the Enuma Anu Enlil Omen series. The Weld-Blundell prism itself deserves closer examination than it typically receives in popular discussions of Sumerian chronology. The prism, acquired by Herbert Weld-Blundell during his travels in Mesopotamia and donated to the Ashmolean in 1923, is a fired clay column approximately 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on all four faces with closely packed cuneiform text. It is not unique. Multiple copies of the King List survive in varying states of completeness across collections at the British Museum, the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad, and the Schoyen Collection in Oslo, demonstrating that the document was considered sufficiently important to copy and distribute widely across Mesopotamian scribal culture. The consistency of the antediluvian rain lengths across these independent copies is one of the most important and least discussed features of the King List tradition. These are not numbers that vary between manuscript traditions in the way that mythological figures typically vary. They are stable, precisely recorded, and internally mathematically coherent across every surviving version. That stability across independently produced manuscripts argues strongly against mythological invention, and toward the recording of a received numerical tradition whose mathematical basis was understood and preserved with scribal care. The mathematical structure of the antediluvian rains extends beyond the simple observation that they are multiples of 3,600. When the complete list is analysed using the number-theoretical tools of Assyriology, specifically the mathematical analysis pioneered by Marvin Powell of Northern Illinois University, in his work on Sumerian metrological systems published in the 1987 volume of the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, a secondary encoding emerges. The 8 antediluvian rains, when expressed in SAR units, form the sequence 8, 10, 12, 8, 10, 12, 8, 18 for the total of 68 es-Sawwan before the flood. This is not an arbitrary sequence. It encodes a pattern of astronomical cycles whose mathematical relationships the Sumerians documented independently in their astronomical literature. The numbers 8, 10, and 12 appear repeatedly in Sumerian astronomical texts as the ratios governing the relationships between the synodic periods of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn respectively, as expressed in the base 60 counting system. The antediluvian King List is not recording individual reigns at all, in the sense that conventional scholarship assumes. It is recording sequential astronomical cycles assigned to named administrative figures who governed the earthly station during each cycle, in the same way that modern administrators hold positions for defined terms rather than indefinite periods. The post-flood portion of the King List provides confirmation of this interpretation through its own internal structure. The transition from antediluvian to post-flood rain lengths is not gradual, as a mythological rationalization process would produce, with rains becoming progressively more human-scale over time. It is abrupt. Before the flood, rulers reigned for thousands of years. After the flood, rulers reigned for hundreds of years, then dozens, then spans recognizable as human lifetimes. This is not a mythological convention becoming more realistic under the influence of historical reality. This is a documented change in the biological and administrative parameters governing earthly rulers, consistent with the transition from direct Anunnaki governance to the governance of human bloodlines carrying diminishing degrees of Anunnaki biological heritage. The Sumerian textual tradition does not describe this transition metaphorically. The administrative texts describe it procedurally, in the language of personnel transitions and biological management programs that the cuneiform record preserves with characteristic bureaucratic precision. The question of what the 3,600-year SAR unit actually represents in astronomical terms has been addressed in the scholarly literature with less rigour than the question deserves. The conventional response is that 3,600 is simply a large round number in the Sumerian base 60 system, the equivalent of 10 times 360, and that the King List's use of it reflects mathematical convention rather than astronomical observation. This response is inadequate for several reasons, the most significant being that the mul.apin astronomical compendium explicitly associates the 3,600-year period with the orbit of a specific celestial body whose characteristics are described in the Enuma Anu Enlil Omen series with enough astronomical detail to constitute a genuine planetary description. The body is called Nibiru, and it is described in terms that distinguish it clearly from the 5 planets the Babylonian astronomers tracked systematically, from cometary phenomena and from any known periodic celestial event. Whether Nibiru represents a real astronomical object whose existence modern science has not confirmed, a historical record of a celestial body that no longer follows its ancient orbit, or something else entirely, the Cuneiform astronomical tradition treats it as a real phenomenon, with real physical consequences for the solar system during its periodic approaches. The antediluvian King List encodes that phenomenon in its chronological framework. That is not mythological exaggeration, it is astronomical record-keeping. Preserved across multiple independent Mesopotamian textual traditions spanning more than 1,500 years of continuous documentation, the 7 Abgallu represent one of the most persistent and specific cultural memories in human history. These were not gods. They were not mythological heroes. In the technical language of the Sumerian administrative tradition, Abgallu designated a specific category of being, the term translating literally as great water being, who served as advisors, technical instructors, and knowledge administrators to the antediluvian kings listed on the Weld-Blundell prism. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek during the 3rd century BC and drawing from temple archives at Babylon that no longer survive, identifies the first of these sages as Owans, described in terms that have made translators uncomfortable for generations. Owans, according to Berossus, possessed the appearance of a fish combined with the capacity to speak and teach. He emerged from the Persian Gulf to instruct early human populations in mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, and temple construction. He returned to the sea each night. He did this for generations. The description is not allegory. In the technical context of Mesopotamian administrative literature, it is testimony, and when examined alongside the fish-suited figures carved into the walls of Assyrian palace complexes at Nimrud and Khorsabad, figures that archaeologists have identified as Abgallu protective spirits, the physical reality implied by these descriptions becomes considerably harder to dismiss. Berossus is not an obscure or unreliable source by the standards of ancient Near Eastern historical writing. He was a Babylonian priest who served during the reign of Antikythera in the 3rd century BC and who wrote his Babylonica, a 3-volume history of Mesopotamian civilization, specifically to make the Babylonian historical tradition accessible to a Greek-speaking audience. The fragments of this work that survive through quotation in later authors, including Josephus, Eusebius, and Alexander Polyhister, preserve details that can be cross-referenced against the cuneiform record with remarkable consistency. Where Berossus can be checked against the tablets, he is accurate in his chronologies, his king lists, and his descriptions of Babylonian institutions. His account of Owans and the other 6 sages who followed him is not presented as mythology. It is presented as history, specifically as the history of how Babylonian civilization received its foundational knowledge. The fish-suited being who emerged from the sea to teach humanity is not a symbol in Berossus's account. It is a figure who performed specific, documentable, transmissible actions that had verifiable consequences for the development of civilization. The Cuneiform tradition independently confirms the 7-sage framework that Berossus preserves. The tablet series known as the Bit Meseri, an incantation text whose primary purpose was apotropaic, the warding off of evil influences, preserves a list of the 7 antediluvian sages with their names, their specific knowledge domains, and the antediluvian kings they served. The Bit Meseri tablets, studied by Erika Reiner of the Oriental Institute in her 1961 analysis of Babylonian apotropaic literature, identify the 7 sages in sequence as Uwana, Uaneduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Each sage is associated with a specific antediluvian king and with specific domains of technical knowledge. Uana, the first sage identified with Berossus' es-Sawwans, served the antediluvian king Enlil and is credited with establishing the foundation of all arts and sciences. The subsequent sages each contributed specific technical domains including medicine, agriculture, celestial observation, and what the text calls the crafts of the deep, a category that the Bit Meseri associates with knowledge of subterranean resources, including minerals and freshwater systems. The precision of these attributions, maintained consistently across the independent Berossus tradition and the cuneiform Bit Meseri tradition, argue strongly against mythological invention and toward the preservation of an administrative memory about specific technical instructors who operated during a documented historical period. The physical representations of the Abgallu in Assyrian palace iconography provide a third independent line of evidence whose implications art historians have documented without pursuing their full logical consequences. The fish-cloaked figures that appear in relief carvings on the walls of the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, constructed by Ashurnasirpal II around 860 BC and excavated by Austin Henry Layard beginning in 1845, are among the most frequently reproduced images in popular discussions of ancient Mesopotamian religion. They are consistently identified in the scholarly literature as protective genies or apotropaic spirits, and their fish cloaks are interpreted as symbolic representations of wisdom or of the water realm associated with Enki. The fish cloaks, however, are not loosely draped symbolic garments. They are depicted in the Nimrud reliefs with consistent anatomical specificity, including the fish head positioned as a helmet over the wearer's own head, the fish body draped along the back with fins extending from the shoulders, and the fishtail visible below the wearer's feet. This is not symbolic representation. This is depiction of a specific, consistent garment whose design has been replicated across multiple palace complexes at Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh, with enough anatomical consistency to suggest that Assyrian artists were working from a stable iconographic tradition based on a real visual memory rather than from pure symbolic invention. The garment being depicted is an environmental suit of some kind, and the being wearing it is depicted as operating in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. Berossus, writing 3 centuries after these palace reliefs were carved, describes precisely this behaviour in his account of Oan. In 1914, Arno Pobel of the University of Pennsylvania published his translation of a damaged Sumerian tablet that had been excavated from Nippur more than 2 decades earlier and left largely unexamined in the museum's storerooms. The tablet, now designated CBS 10673 in the University Museum collection, contained what Pobel recognized as a creation and flood narrative substantially older than any known version of the Gilgamesh epic. He called it the Eridu Genesis. What distinguishes this document from later flood narratives is its specificity. The Eridu Genesis does not describe a world-destroying deluge as divine punishment for human wickedness in generic terms. It names 5 specific cities that existed before the flood: Eridu, Batibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, and identifies each city's patron deity and its specific administrative function within the antediluvian governance system. Eridu served as Enki's primary terrestrial base of operations. Batibira housed metallurgical and agricultural research facilities. Sippar functioned as what the text calls the City of the Sun God, an astronomical observation centre. The archaeological confirmation of these cities' existence has proceeded steadily over the past century. All 5 have been located. All 5 show occupation layers extending to the Ubaid period, before 4000 BC, predating the conventional dating of Sumerian civilization's emergence. And at Eridu specifically, the 17 superimposed building levels discovered during Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavations in the 1940s reveal a temple tradition of unbroken continuity stretching back to approximately 5500 BC, a full 2000 years before Sumer is supposed to have existed. Pobel's 1914 translation work was conducted against a backdrop of expanding Mesopotamian scholarship that was simultaneously grappling with the discovery that the biblical flood narrative had antecedents in Sumerian literature that predated the Hebrew text by more than a millennium. The Eridu Genesis added a new dimension to this already challenging scholarly conversation by presenting a flood narrative that was embedded within a creation account and a city founding account in ways that the later Gilgamesh epic does not replicate. The Gilgamesh flood narrative is a story about an individual's survival of a divine catastrophe. The Eridu Genesis is a document about the administrative history of pre-flood civilization, within which, the flood appears as a transitional event rather than as the central dramatic episode. This difference in framing is not a minor literary variation. It reflects a fundamental difference in the purpose for which the two texts were produced. The Eridu Genesis is not telling a story about a flood. It is recording the administrative history of a period that the flood brought to an end, and the flood appears in it because that administrative history cannot be complete without accounting for the event that terminated it. The 5 cities named in the Eridu Genesis have been excavated to varying degrees of completeness, and the archaeological record from each is consistent with the administrative functions the text assigns them. Eridu, excavated most thoroughly by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949, produced the 17 superimposed temple levels already mentioned, along with evidence of sophisticated hydraulic engineering in its earliest occupation layers that matches the text's description of Eridu as Enki's domain, the site where the Lord of the Abzu established his operations at the junction of the freshwater and the saltwater realms. The earliest Eridu temple, designated Temple Level 17 by Safar and Lloyd, dates to approximately 5500 BC and consists of a small mud brick structure barely 3 meters on a side, with a central offering table and a niche for a cult statue. By Temple Level 6, approximately 4000 BC, the structure has grown to a complex of interconnected rooms covering hundreds of square meters, with evidence of sophisticated drainage systems, administrative storage areas, and what appears to be a specialized processing chamber whose function the excavation report does not identify but whose floor deposits contained high concentrations of metallic slag and mineral residues. The progression from Temple Level 17 to Temple Level 6 is not the progression of a simple religious tradition elaborating its ritual practices. It is the progression of an operational installation, expanding its physical infrastructure over 15 centuries of continuous activity. Sippar, identified in the Eridu Genesis as the city designated for solar observation, and whose excavation at Abu Haba by Ormuzd Rassam in 1881 produced one of the largest single-site cuneiform tablet caches ever recovered, has yielded astronomical texts whose sophistication is consistent with the Eridu Genesis's identification of the site as an observation center. The Sippar tablets include eclipse prediction tables, planetary observation logs, and stellar position records that demonstrate continuous astronomical monitoring across multiple centuries. The precision of these observations required not only trained personnel, but also standardized instruments and established recording protocols. Exactly the kind of institutional infrastructure that the Eridu Genesis implies was established at Sippar under divine administrative direction. That astronomical tradition at Sippar can be traced in the tablet record back to the earliest historical periods of Mesopotamian civilization, suggests not that Sippar developed an astronomical tradition independently over time, but that it inherited one from the period the Eridu Genesis describes as predating the flood. The 5 cities named in the Eridu Genesis are not mythological inventions. They are historical sites with archaeological profiles that match the administrative functions assigned to them in a text composed more than 4,000 years ago. The congruence between text and archaeology at all 5 sites, across excavations conducted by different national teams across more than a century, is not coincidence, it is confirmation. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, from the earliest Sumerian hymns to the late Babylonian creation epics, a specific class of object appears with remarkable consistency under the designation Dupshimati in Akkadian, the Tablets of Destiny. Conventional scholarship treats these as mythological symbols representing divine authority in an abstract sense. The cuneiform texts themselves suggest something considerably more specific. The Tablets of Destiny appear in administrative context, not mythological ones. They are described as objects that could be held, worn, stolen, and recovered. Their loss creates specific operational crises, not symbolic disorder, but actual failures in the administration of natural phenomena. In the Epic of Anzu, preserved in 3 distinct recensions spanning from the Old Babylonian to the Neo-Assyrian period, the tablets are stolen by the stormbird Anzu from the sleeping figure of Enlil. The immediate consequence is not symbolic chaos. It is functional failure. Weather systems cease to operate correctly. Celestial movements become unpredictable. Administrative authority collapses not because of a broken metaphor, but because a physical device has been removed from operational use. The Babylonian text designated K3454 in the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection provides the most technically detailed description of these objects, characterizing them as shining like stars, speaking with voices of thunder when activated, and requiring specific knowledge to operate, a description that has no parallel in known mythological traditions, but aligns closely with descriptions of sophisticated technology in multiple ancient Near Eastern sources. The three recensions of the Epic of Anzu deserve more careful comparative analysis than they typically receive in discussions of Mesopotamian mythology. The Old Babylonian version, preserved in fragmentary form across tablets in the British Museum and the University Museum at Philadelphia, is the oldest and in several respects the most technically specific of the three. The Neo-Assyrian version, discovered in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and studied in detail by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard in their 1973 critical edition, is the most complete but shows evidence of literary elaboration that has smoothed over technical details preserved in the older version. The Sumerian precursor tradition, whose existence is attested by references in other Sumerian literary texts, but whose primary tablets have not been recovered, almost certainly underlies both. What all three versions share is the operational specificity of the tablet's functions. When Anzu seizes the tablets from Enlil, the text of the Old Babylonian version does not describe a disruption of divine authority in symbolic terms. It describes a series of specific malfunctions. The word that could be translated as fate or destiny in the tablet's name, Shematu, is the same word used throughout Mesopotamian administrative and legal literature to designate binding determinations, formal decrees with operational force. The tablets of Shematu are not metaphors for authority. They are the physical instruments through which authority is exercised, and their removal produces functional failure because the systems they operate cannot function without them. The description of the tablet's physical characteristics across multiple cuneiform sources provides enough detail to construct a reasonably specific picture of what these objects were. They are consistently described as luminous, employing the Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary of light emission that the astronomical texts use for celestial bodies, rather than the vocabulary of reflected brilliance used for polished metals. They are described as speaking, using the verb that the cuneiform lexical tradition employs for the transmission of intelligible language, rather than the verb for sound production more generally. They respond to specific operators, since the crisis created by Anzu's theft is not merely that the tablets are in the wrong hands, but that Anzu does not know how to operate them correctly, creating cascading system failures that a competent operator would have prevented, and they are worn on the body by their legitimate operator, a detail that the Neo-Assyrian version preserves in the description of Enlil's tablet as hanging at his breast, suggesting a portable device of manageable physical dimensions rather than the massive inscribed monument that the word tablet typically evokes for a modern reader. Taken together, these characteristics describe a sophisticated technological device that stores and executes operational protocols, responds to authorized operators, and controls systems governing atmospheric and celestial phenomena. That description has no analogue in the mythological traditions of any culture on Earth. It has considerable analogues in the technological literature of the present century. The operational crisis produced by the tablet's theft extends the technical picture further. The Anzu epic describes the failure of celestial movements to follow their established patterns, the disruption of atmospheric systems, and the collapse of the decision-making authority that governed the Anunnaki administration. These failures are presented as direct mechanical consequences of the tablet's removal rather than as divine punishments or symbolic expressions of disorder. The language the text employs is the language of system failure, of processes that cannot proceed because the controlling mechanism has been disabled. The resolution of the crisis requires not a ritual restoration of symbolic authority, but the physical recovery of the tablets and their return to an authorized operator who can restore the systems to correct function. Ninurta's eventual defeat of Anzu and recovery of the tablets is followed immediately by the normalization of the disrupted systems, presented as a direct operational consequence of restoring the controlling device to proper custody. This cause and effect relationship between the physical object and the operational systems it governs is not how mythological objects behave in any other tradition. Sacred objects in mythology confer power, represent authority, or serve as conduits for divine will. They do not control weather systems through mechanisms that fail predictably when the object is removed and resume function when it is recovered. The distribution of dupe Shemirti references across the cuneiform corpus reveals a pattern that reinforces the operational interpretation. These objects appear most frequently not in mythological narratives, but in administrative and ritual texts concerned with the proper conduct of governance, the maintenance of celestial order, and the legitimate exercise of authority over natural systems. The Nippur temple records that reference the tablets of destiny do so in contexts that associate them with specific physical locations within the temple complex, specific custodians responsible for their maintenance, and specific operational procedures governing their use. This is not the treatment of symbolic objects in a mythological tradition. It is the treatment of sensitive operational equipment in an administrative record. The fact that the tablets are referenced across administrative, mythological, hymnic, and ritual cuneiform genres simultaneously does not indicate their symbolic nature. It indicates their centrality to the Anunnaki administrative system, a centrality that left traces across every category of Mesopotamian written culture, because the tablets governed systems that affected every aspect of life in Mesopotamian civilization. The Atra-Hasis Epic, composed during the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, but demonstrably derived from Sumerian sources several centuries older, contains the most technically specific creation narrative in the ancient world. Its account of human origins has been translated, published, and quietly set aside by mainstream scholarship because its content presents an interpretive problem that conventional frameworks cannot resolve. The epic does not describe humanity as being shaped from clay in a vague, metaphorical sense. It describes a specific procedure. The Anunnaki Council, faced with a labour crisis among their own ranks, the lesser Igigi gods having revolted against the burden of canal digging and agricultural maintenance, convenes to authorize the creation of a worker species. Enki proposes the solution. The goddess Nintu, working under Enki's technical direction, mixes clay with the blood of a slain god, a being identified as Wi-Ilu or Kingu depending on the recension, and produces 14 initial specimens in a gestation chamber, 7 male and 7 female. The text specifies that this process requires a purification procedure for the divine material before it can be incorporated into the clay substrate. It specifies a fixed gestation period. It describes the offspring as Lulu-Amelu, the mixed worker, a being that is explicitly identified as neither fully human nor fully divine, but as a deliberate hybrid combining characteristics of both source materials. The Cambridge Assyriologist W. G. Lambert, whose translation work on the Atra-Hasis Epic remains the scholarly standard, noted in his 1969 edition that the creation sequence employs technical vocabulary more consistent with a procedural description than with mythological narrative, and then declined to pursue the implications of that observation. Lambert's restraint is understandable within the institutional context of 1969 academic Assyriology, but the technical vocabulary he identified has become progressively harder to explain away as the decades since his landmark edition have produced advances in molecular biology that provide a precise scientific language for what the text appears to describe. The purification of the divine material before its incorporation into the clay substrate corresponds, in molecular biological terms, to the isolation and preparation of genetic material before its introduction into a host cell. The fixed gestation period corresponds to the controlled incubation of a developing organism. The production of 14 initial specimens in a structured sequence of 7 male and 7 female corresponds to the controlled production of matched experimental subjects. The designation of the result as Lalu-Amelu, the mixed worker, employs the Akkadian word Lulu, which carries the specific connotation of mixture or combination, not the vocabulary of divine creation or simple formation from raw material. Lambert himself noted that Lulu-Amelu is a technical designation rather than a descriptive epithet, and that its technical precision was unusual in the context of creation mythology across the ancient Near East. He attributed the precision to the text's literary sophistication, rather than to the possibility that the text was describing an actual technical procedure. The second interpretation, however, fits the text more completely than the first. The Atra-Hasis Epic does not describe the creation of humanity as a unique event, but as a reproducible process. After the initial 14 specimens are produced, the text describes the establishment of procedures for ongoing reproduction, the setting of a normal birth process that the mixed worker population would carry forward independently. This transition from laboratory production to self-sustaining biological reproduction is not a feature of any other ancient creation narrative. It is, however, a feature of any genetic engineering program that intends its product to propagate without continuous intervention. The Sumerian predecessor texts to the Atra-Hasis, including the fragmentary Sumerian creation myth recovered from Nippur and translated by Kramer in his 1944 monograph, preserve additional details about the initial production process that the Akkadian recension abbreviates. These Sumerian fragments describe Enki as performing what the text calls the examination of the clay, a procedure conducted before the mixing that involved assessing the clay's properties and determining its suitability for the purpose. The vocabulary of examination used here is the vocabulary of evaluation and testing, not of ritual preparation. It is the vocabulary of an engineer assessing raw materials before a manufacturing process. The labour crisis that motivates the creation of humanity in the Atra-Hasis Epic deserves examination in its own right, because its details reveal aspects of the Anunnaki operation that mythological interpretation consistently obscures. The Igigi, the lesser divine beings, are described as performing specific physical labour, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, processing agricultural outputs. This labour is described as exhausting, as extending across enormous time periods, and as ultimately producing a collective refusal to continue. The Igigi rebellion, which occupies the opening section of the epic, is a labour action in the most literal sense of the term. Workers refuse to perform assigned tasks. The supervisors, the senior Anunnaki, convene to assess the situation and determine a solution. The solution is not disciplinary action against the rebellious workers, it is process redesign. The labour that the Igigi were performing is reassigned to a newly created category of worker, the Lulu Amelu, who are produced specifically to perform it. This is not a mythological narrative about the divine origin of human suffering. It is an administrative record of a workforce management problem and the engineering solution that resolved it. The operational specificity of the labour being performed, the specific construction and maintenance tasks enumerated in the text, and the administrative process by which the solution is authorised and implemented are not features of myth. They are features of institutional memory. Before any discussion of the Anunnaki's contributions to Mesopotamian civilization can be evaluated against the archaeological record, it is necessary to establish precisely what the pre-Sumerian technological baseline actually was, and here the evidence presents a picture dramatically different from the one found in standard archaeological textbooks. The site of Tel es-Sawwan in central Iraq, excavated between 1964 and 1968 by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar under the auspices of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, revealed a settlement dating to approximately 6000 BC that should not exist according to conventional developmental models. The pottery recovered from Tel es-Sawwan's deepest occupation levels, Samarra ware named for the nearby city, displays decorative patterns that archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom subjected to computational analysis in the 1970s. Thom's findings, published in the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society, demonstrated that the geometric motifs on Sumerian pottery encode precise mathematical relationships corresponding to observed astronomical phenomena, including the tracking of stellar risings, lunar cycles, and the solar year with accuracy that requires both sophisticated observational capabilities and a mathematical framework for recording and transmitting the resulting data. A community operating at Neolithic subsistence level does not spontaneously produce pottery that encodes accurate astronomical calculations. The knowledge must have preceded the pottery. And the question of where a 6000 BC agricultural community in central Iraq acquired sophisticated astronomical mathematics is one that Tel es-Sawwan's excavation reports acknowledge but do not answer. Tel es-Sawwan is not an isolated anomaly in the pre-Sumerian archaeological record of Mesopotamia. It is part of a consistent pattern of sites from the Ubaid and Halaf periods, spanning roughly 6500 to 4000 BC, that demonstrate levels of architectural sophistication, agricultural organisation, and mathematical knowledge that conventional developmental models cannot account for through internal cultural evolution alone. The Halaf culture, distributed across a territory extending from southeastern Turkey through northern Syria into northern Iraq, produced pottery during the 6th millennium BC that exhibits firing temperatures and glaze compositions requiring kiln technology of considerable sophistication, along with geometric decorative schemes that encode mathematical proportional relationships consistent with familiarity with advanced geometry. The Halaf site of Arpachir in northern Iraq, excavated by Max Mallowan of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq in 1933, produced a series of round buildings designated tholoi by the excavators, whose architectural proportions and construction techniques showed knowledge of geometric principles that Mallowan attributed to contact with more advanced cultures to the east, without being able to identify those cultures. The more advanced cultures to the east that Mallowan's evidence implied have never been satisfactorily identified by conventional archaeology, because conventional archaeology has no mechanism for their existence within its developmental models. The Eridu Genesis, however, names them. They are the cities administered by the Anunnaki before the flood. The specific site of Tel es-Sawwan adds to the architectural evidence at the Arpachir tholoi through its discovery of irrigation infrastructure whose engineering precision exceeds what a community at the Neolithic-Chalcolithic boundary should possess. The Tel es-Sawwan canals, documented in the 1964 through 1968 excavation reports by Safar and Muhammad Ali Mustafa, are not simple diversion channels of the kind produced by trial and error in early agricultural communities. They are engineered hydraulic systems designed according to gradient calculations that require surveying instruments and mathematical frameworks capable of maintaining consistent slope measurements across distances of several hundred meters through terrain with minimal natural gradient. The error tolerance in these gradient calculations, measured by modern survey instruments against the surviving canal beds, is approximately 2%, a precision that in a modern context would require optical levelling instruments and systematic survey methodology. The community that built these canals in 6000 BC did not develop the mathematics required for their design through subsistence agriculture. That mathematics was given to them, or transmitted to them, from a source that already possessed it. The tablet designated CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology's Near Eastern collection was excavated from Nippur's temple precinct during the expedition seasons of 1895 through 1897, catalogued by the museum's curatorial staff, and subsequently studied by a succession of Assyriologists whose published translations have consistently framed its content within a conventional mythological interpretive framework. A careful reading of the tablet against the backdrop of administrative cuneiform literature from the same period suggests that this framework fundamentally distorts what the text is actually saying. The tablet opens with the standard Enlil invocation, but transitions rapidly into language that belongs not to hymnic or mythological literature, but to the genre of administrative council records, a genre well attested in the Nippur corpus, and recognizable by its specific syntactic conventions, its use of numerical precision, and its dry, procedural tone. The divine assembly, the text states, having determined that the earthly mission has reached completion and that the appointed cycles have concluded, resolved in council that the time for departure had arrived. The phrase translated as appointed cycles does not employ mythological terminology. It employs the same astronomical vocabulary found in the mul.apin compendium and the Enuma Anu Enlil Omen series, the language of celestial calculation, of predetermined astronomical timelines, of cosmic schedules maintained with mathematical precision across spans of time that dwarf recorded human history. The procedural sections that follow the council determination in CBS 10,673 represent the most operationally specific content in the departure text tradition. Where the opening determination is made in elevated council language appropriate to a formal resolution, the subsequent sections shift into the dry, precise terminology of administrative implementation. Specific domains of responsibility are enumerated. Named individuals are assigned closure tasks within each domain. Timelines for the completion of each closure task are specified. The sequence of these assignments follows a logical operational order, with the decommissioning of active facilities preceding the sealing of archival repositories, and the sealing of repositories preceding the formal departure ceremony at Eridu that the fragmentary Eridu Genesis passages describe. This procedural logic is not the logic of religious narrative, which organizes events according to dramatic and theological significance. It is the logic of operational planning, which organizes events according to the requirements of safe and complete closure. The tablet is reading like a decommissioning checklist because that is what it is. The astronomical vocabulary that appears throughout CBS 10,673 connects the departure decision to a specific celestial timing framework that other cuneiform sources elaborate in detail. The phrase translated as appointed cycles employs the Sumerian term an-bida, which in astronomical context specifically designates periods calculated in relation to the orbital cycles of celestial bodies, rather than simply the passage of time. The Enuma Anu Enlil series, the comprehensive Babylonian astronomical omen collection whose Sumerian antecedents extend back into the 3rd millennium BC, uses the same term in sections dealing with the movements of the celestial body designated Nibiru, the planet of the crossing. The connection between the departure timing and the Nibiru cycle documented in the astronomical literature provides a specific astronomical framework for understanding when the departure occurred and when any return might be anticipated, a framework that later Mesopotamian prophetic literature develops in considerable detail and that the tablet tradition preserves with the mathematical precision characteristic of the cuneiform astronomical record at its most rigorous. In the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Sanliurfa, a site that has permanently altered the timeline of human civilization sits partially excavated beneath a low artificial mound that was, the archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates, deliberately constructed to bury what lay beneath it. Göbekli Tepe, whose systematic excavation began under German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1994 and continued until Schmidt's death in 2014, presents the archaeological community with a compound problem. The site dates to approximately 9600 BC, making its massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth by a margin of 6,000 years. The pillars are carved with bas-reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and on the central pillars of Enclosure D, anthropomorphic figures whose arm positions and belt-like waist markings suggest representation of beings rather than mere decorative motifs. None of this is the compound problem. The compound problem is that around 8000 BC, the entire complex was systematically filled in with compacted rubble and deliberately buried, not by erosion, not by abandonment, not by conquest, but by the deliberate organized labor of a human population that chose to seal it. The cuneiform tablet series from Nippur that describes underground archive construction, specifically the passages in the Eridu Genesis that reference the preservation of the Mi, the divine decrees, in sealed subterranean repositories before the Great Flood, provides a textual framework for understanding what Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial may actually represent. Klaus Schmidt's excavation methodology at Göbekli Tepe was meticulous, and his published analysis of the site's stratigraphy provides the basis for the deliberate burial conclusion that has become the consensus among specialists who have examined the evidence. The backfill material that covers the pillar enclosures is not random debris accumulated through natural processes of erosion and habitation refuse, which is what is typically found covering abandoned prehistoric sites. It is sorted, compacted material of specific composition, brought from locations around the site, and deposited in a controlled manner that achieved even coverage across the enclosures while protecting the pillar carvings from direct contact with abrasive material. The labour investment required to produce this backfill represents thousands of person-hours of organised effort expended not on construction or food production, but specifically on concealment. No community invests that quantity of organised labour in burying a site, unless burying it is a priority that outranks other uses of available labour. The question of why burying Göbekli Tepe was a priority of that magnitude has not been satisfactorily answered by conventional archaeological interpretation. The iconographic content of the Göbekli Tepe pillars provides additional evidence that connects the site to the broader tradition of Anunnaki human interaction documented in the cuneiform record. The central pillars of Enclosure D, the oldest and most elaborate of the excavated enclosures, bear anthropomorphic carvings that differ markedly from the animal reliefs on the surrounding pillars. These central pillars have what appear to be arms, indicated by low-relief carvings along the sides of the T-shaped pillar shafts, and belt-like decorations around their middles that match the belt features described in cuneiform texts as characteristic of divine beings in physical manifestation. The fox fur loincloths depicted on several pillars correspond to descriptions in Mesopotamian literature of specific garments associated with particular categories of divine beings. The vulture imagery, prominent at Göbekli Tepe and also significant in Mesopotamian astronomical symbolism, appears in the Enuma Anu Enlil series in connection with specific celestial phenomena associated with transition periods between cosmic cycles. The iconographic vocabulary of Göbekli Tepe is not the iconographic vocabulary of a simple Neolithic hunting society. It is the iconographic vocabulary of a culture that understood the cosmic framework documented in Mesopotamian administrative literature, a culture that built its most important site according to principles derived from that framework, and then, when the time came, buried it according to procedures that the same framework prescribed for the preservation of essential knowledge against future catastrophe. The geological and archaeological evidence for the catastrophe that made that burial necessary converges on a specific time period. The Younger Dryas impact event, dated by the geochemical signature in sediment cores from sites across North America, Europe and Asia to approximately 12,900 years ago, created a sudden and severe global climate disruption whose effects on human populations would have been catastrophic. The platinum anomaly, the nanodiamond concentrations, the shocked quartz, and the carbon spherules that mark the Younger Dryas boundary layer have been identified at sites from Greenland to Mexico to Belgium, indicating a cosmic impact event of continental or global scale. Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial, dated to approximately 10,000 BC, occurs within the recovery period following this event. The Cuneiform tradition's description of a great flood that terminated the antediluvian administrative period and required the preservation of essential knowledge in sealed underground repositories describes, in the language of institutional memory, precisely the kind of civilizational catastrophe that the Younger Dryas impact event represents in the geological record. The community that buried Göbekli Tepe was not hiding it from enemies or abandoning it as obsolete. It was sealing it against the possibility that what had already happened once might happen again, following procedures that the administrative tradition it inherited had established specifically for that purpose. The standard scholarly interpretation of Mesopotamian ziggurat complexes treats these massive stepped structures as elevated temple platforms, artificial mountains constructed to bring worshippers symbolically closer to the gods. This interpretation accounts for their height and their temple crowns. It does not account for their internal architecture. The systematic excavation of Mesopotamian ziggurats over the past century and a half has revealed internal chamber systems, acoustic configurations, and astronomical alignment features that have no functional explanation within a purely religious interpretive framework but align precisely with descriptions found in administrative cuneiform texts that treat these structures as operational communication and observation facilities. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, whose excavation by the German Oriental Society beginning in 1899 and continuing through the 20th century, has produced detailed architectural documentation, rises in 7 distinct levels, oriented with mathematical precision to specific stellar configurations that were astronomically significant during the Uruk period, approximately 3,200 BC. Sound tests conducted within the surviving internal chambers of Mesopotamian ziggurat complexes by archaeoacoustician Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield between 2012 and 2017 demonstrated resonance properties that amplify specific frequency ranges while dampening others, properties that require deliberate acoustic engineering rather than incidental architectural arrangement, and that match descriptions in cuneiform texts of sacred spaces where the voices of divine beings could be heard distinctly. Rupert Till's acoustic research at Mesopotamian sites has been published in the peer-reviewed literature on archaeoacoustics, and provides a technical baseline for understanding what the ziggurat builders actually constructed when they created these internal chamber systems. The resonance frequencies that Till measured in surviving Mesopotamian chamber configurations cluster around 80 to 110 Hz, a range that corresponds to the fundamental frequencies of the male baritone and bass vocal registers, and that produces, in enclosed stone chambers of the dimensions typical of ziggurat interiors, a reverberation pattern that causes sound originating from a single localized source to appear to emanate from the walls and ceiling simultaneously. This effect, documented in Till's published measurements, creates the auditory impression of a voice that surrounds the listener rather than originating from a specific direction, an effect that cuneiform ritual texts describe consistently as the characteristic signature of divine communication within the temple complex. The acoustic engineering required to produce this effect is not accidental. It requires deliberate selection of chamber dimensions, wall material, and surface finish to achieve specific resonance characteristics, and the consistency of these characteristics across multiple independent ziggurat complexes at different sites indicates that their builders were working from a standardized design specification, rather than producing incidental acoustic effects through arbitrary architectural choices. The astronomical alignment features of the Anu ziggurat provide a second independent line of evidence for its function as an operational observation facility. The structure's 7-level configuration, each level reduced in area from the one below by a consistent proportional ratio, creates a stepped profile whose summit platform is elevated approximately 14 meters above the surrounding plain. The orientation of the structure's primary axis, measured by the German Oriental Society excavation team and confirmed by subsequent survey work, deviates from true north by exactly 6 degrees and 12 minutes of arc. This deviation is not a construction error. It corresponds to the azimuth of the rising point of the Pleiades star cluster at the latitude of Uruk during the period approximately 3200 BC, when the structure's white temple crown was constructed. The Pleiades, designated in Sumerian astronomical literature as the mul, the star of stars, occupy a position of exceptional significance in the mul.apin compendium, where they serve as the primary reference constellation for the beginning of the agricultural year and as a navigational marker described in terms that extend well beyond ordinary calendar keeping into the domain of celestial route designation that the mul.apin's 3 pathways of heaven encode. An architectural structure whose primary axis is oriented to the Pleiades rising point is not a temple oriented symbolically toward a sacred constellation. It is an observation facility aligned operationally with a specific celestial reference point. The internal chamber systems of the Anu ziggurat at Uruk, documented in the German Oriental Society's excavation reports from the first half of the 20th century, and reanalyzed in the 1980s by the Deutsche Archäologische Institut under the direction of Jörg Schmid, include features whose functional purpose conventional architectural analysis has not satisfactorily explained. The chambers on the structure's lower levels, accessible through narrow corridors whose dimensions suggest controlled access rather than processional movement, contain wall niches positioned at heights and angles that align with specific astronomical phenomena visible through the corridor entrances during particular seasons. The floor surfaces of several chambers show evidence of metallic residues whose chemical composition, analysed by the Institute for Archaeometry at the Technische Universität Dresden, includes trace elements consistent with the processing of rare earth minerals under high-temperature conditions. The ventilation systems integrated into the chamber walls maintain airflow patterns that archaeologists have documented but not explained within the framework of ordinary temple function. These features, taken individually, admit of multiple interpretations. Taken together, they describe a facility designed for specific technical operations that combined atmospheric control, precise astronomical observation, and materials processing in a configuration that has no parallel in any known religious architecture from the ancient world. The Cuneiform texts that describe ziggurat function in operational rather than purely religious terms provide the interpretive context that the archaeological evidence requires. The Sumerian hymn to the Eker, Enlil's temple complex at Nippur, preserved in the Nippur corpus and studied by Uki Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania in his 1969 analysis of Sumerian temple hymns, describes the Eker not as a place of worship, but as a facility that establishes connection between what the text calls the place above and the place below. The Sumerian terminology for this connection is not the vocabulary of prayer or ritual approach to divinity. It is the vocabulary of communication technology, of channels and pathways and established links that require maintenance and correct operation to function. The hymn describes the Ekur as possessing a mouth that reaches the heaven, an ear that hears the earth below, and a voice whose words are carried to distant places. These are not poetic metaphors for a building's spiritual significance. In the context of the administrative cuneiform literature with which this hymn coexists in the Nippur corpus, they are technical descriptions of a communication facility whose components include input systems, output systems, and signal transmission capabilities that extend across distances measured not in the meters of a ceremonial precinct but in the vast expanses between terrestrial and celestial operational domains. Among the most overlooked categories of evidence bearing on the question of Anunnaki presence and departure in Mesopotamia are the administrative and economic records from major temple complexes during the late the Thuyi period, approximately 2100 to 2000 BC. the period that cuneiform departure texts identify as coinciding with the formal Anunnaki withdrawal. These records, preserved in the Drihem archive discovered near Nippur and now distributed across collections at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the British Museum, and the Yale Babylonian Collection, document tributary flows of livestock, precious metals, rare stones, and biological materials to temple complexes at volumes that dramatically exceed any plausible religious or administrative requirement. The Drihem tablets, there are more than 15,000 of them covering a period of approximately 45 years during the reign of Shulgi and his successors, record daily deliveries of cattle, sheep, goats, and exotic animals to the Enlil temple complex at Nippur, and to processing facilities whose ultimate destinations the tablets do not name. The quantities are staggering. During peak years of the Ur-3 period, the Nippur complex received and processed thousands of animals per month. The tablets distinguish carefully between animals destined for conventional sacrificial and dietary use and animals destined for what the administrative language calls the Great Work, a designation that appears repeatedly in contexts suggesting something other than religious ceremony, and that corresponds, in its Sumerian terminology, to the phrase used in the departure narrative tablets to describe the preparation of vessels for the return journey. The Drihem archive's significance for understanding the departure period has been recognized by only a small number of Assyriologists, most notably Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University, whose analysis of the Ur-3 administrative system published across a series of papers between 1987 and 2009 identifies anomalies in the Drihem tributary records that standard interpretations of the archive cannot account for. Steinkeller documented a category of Drihem tablets that record the delivery of specific animal species to designated processing facilities under administrative oversight that bypassed the normal temple redistribution system. These animals, unlike the vast majority of Drihem documented livestock whose journeys through the temple economy can be traced from delivery through slaughter, through distribution of meat, hides and byproducts, enter the recording system and then disappear without any corresponding record of their disposition. The administrative language used to mark these animals in the Drihem tablets employs a category designation that Steinkeller translates cautiously as reserved for special purpose, noting that the Sumerian terminology carries connotations of extraction rather than sacrifice, of the removal of specific biological components rather than the conventional temple use of an animal's entire body. The quantities of animals processed through this reserve category during the final decades of the Ur-3 period increased dramatically, peaking in the reign of Amarsin, and then ceasing abruptly at precisely the point when the cuneiform departure texts document the conclusion of the Great Work. The metal and mineral tributary records preserved in the Drihem archive provide an equally anomalous economic picture for the departure period. The tablets document deliveries of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and what the administrative language designates as an.bar, sky iron, to processing facilities at the Nippur temple complex in quantities and compositions that exceed any documented use of these materials in known Mesopotamian manufacturing, construction, or ritual contexts. The designation an-bar is particularly significant. In standard Assyriological usage, an-bar refers to meteoric iron derived from extraterrestrial sources rather than from terrestrial smelting, and it appears throughout Mesopotamian administrative literature as a material of exceptional value and rarity. During the final Ur-3 period, the Drihem tablets record deliveries of an-bar in quantities that would require either an extraordinary concentration of meteoric iron collection activity across a wide geographical area or access to a non-meteoric iron source, since the documented quantities exceed what random meteor fall rates could plausibly supply. The processing of this material is documented as occurring in facilities that the tablets locate within the inner precincts of the Nippur temple complex, in areas that archaeological excavation has identified as having undergone intensive high-temperature processing of unknown materials, evidenced by slag deposits and heat-altered floor surfaces, whose composition does not match ordinary metalworking waste. The silver tablet CBS 16042, identified by its museum designation in the University of Pennsylvania collection, and studied by Assyriologist David Owen in his analysis of Ur-3 metal records, records a transaction involving what the text calls metal of the great vessels of return. This phrase, which Owen noted in his published translation without further comment, employs the same Sumerian compound term found in the departure narrative tablets for the vessels described in the closure ceremony at Eridu. The quantity of processed metal recorded in CBS 16042 is substantial enough to suggest structural application rather than decorative use, and the specific alloy composition required by the transaction document, preserved in the proportional specifications typical of III administrative metal records, describes a copper-gold-platinum alloy whose electromagnetic properties would not be formally characterized by materials science until the 20th century, but which cuneiform metallurgical texts from the same period associate with objects required for what they call the connection of the house above with the house below. The economic record of the departure period is not the record of a religious institution conducting ordinary temple operations. It is the record of a massive procurement and processing effort, directed toward specific technical requirements that the administrative language of the tablets, read without the filter of conventional mythological interpretation, identifies with unmistakable clarity as the preparation of departure infrastructure. The god Enki's primary domain in Sumerian cosmology was the Abzu, typically translated as the underground freshwater ocean, believed by the Sumerians to lie beneath the Earth's surface. This translation is accurate as far as it goes, but it captures only the cosmological symbolism and misses the operational specificity with which cuneiform texts describe this domain. The text known as Enki and the World Order, preserved in a relatively complete Sumerian version from the Old Babylonian period, and studied in detail by Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania and Och Sjöberg of the same institution in their collaborative work published in 1989, does not describe the Abzu as a metaphysical realm. It describes it as a physical installation. Enki's Abzu has a house, the Abzu, with specific architectural features including chambers, a surrounding moat, a gate, and internal spaces designated for different functional purposes. The text specifies that Enki established his Abzu at Eridu in a specific relationship to the local groundwater table, using the freshwater access not for symbolic purposes, but for operational ones that the text associates with genetic research, material processing, and what translators have rendered as the shaping of the black-headed people. The 17 building levels at Eridu, reaching down to the water table that the Sumerians themselves identified as Enki's domain, are not 17 phases of a developing religious tradition. They are 17 phases of a continuously operating installation whose deepest levels remain incompletely excavated. Enki and the World Order is among the longest Sumerian literary texts recovered from the Nippur corpus, extending across multiple tablets to a total of approximately 500 lines in the most complete surviving version. Its organization is not narrative but administrative. The text proceeds through a systematic enumeration of the domains over which Enki exercises authority, specifying for each domain the specific operational activities Enki performs, the personnel he assigns to manage each domain, and the technological systems he establishes to maintain each domain's proper function. This organizational structure is the structure of a position description, or an operational charter, not the structure of a myth. The domains covered include the deep waters, the agricultural system, the building trade, the textile industry, the animal husbandry system, the boundary marking of territorial claims, and what the text designates as the destiny of the black-headed people, the biological and developmental trajectory of the human population under Anunnaki management. For each domain, Enki is described as performing specific technical actions rather than simply willing outcomes into existence, measuring, calculating, establishing rates and quotas, installing personnel, and setting operational parameters that the assigned personnel are directed to maintain. The genetic research function attributed to Enki's Abzu installation receives the most detailed treatment in the text's account of the shaping of the black-headed people. The Sumerian vocabulary used for this activity is not the vocabulary of divine creation from nothing. It is the vocabulary of craft production, of skilled manipulation of materials according to established technical procedures. The verb translated as shaping is the same verb used in Sumerian texts for the work of a potter forming clay on a wheel or a metal worker shaping molten metal in a mold, activities governed by technical knowledge and requiring skilled execution. The object of this shaping activity is designated not as an abstract humanity, but as the black-headed people in a specific historical and biological sense, a population whose characteristics and capacities are presented as outcomes of Enki's technical work rather than as given features of a species. The Abzu, as the facility within which this work is conducted, is described with enough architectural specificity to suggest a real physical structure rather than a mythological setting. Its chambers serve distinct functions. Its moat and gate control access. Its internal arrangement follows a logic that the text presents as serving the operational requirements of the work conducted within it. The 17 building levels at Eridu documented by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd during the 1946 through 1949 excavation seasons do not present an archaeological picture consistent with a simple religious tradition, developing its temple architecture over 2 millennia. Temple level 17, the earliest, is a small structure of approximately 3 meters on a side with a single central room, an offering table, and a wall niche consistent with early cult practice. By temple level 8, approximately 4500 BC, the complex has expanded to incorporate multiple interconnected rooms, storage facilities, and what the excavation report identifies as a specialized processing area whose floor deposits contained concentrations of mineral residues and organic compounds inconsistent with ordinary temple activity. By temple level 6, the complex shows evidence of sophisticated water management systems, including channels connected to the groundwater table below and drainage structures that directed water flow through specific areas of the building. These water management features are not paralleled in any other contemporary Mesopotamian temple complex. They are, however, consistent with the description in Enki and the World Order of the Abzu as an installation that operates in deliberate relationship with the underground freshwater system, drawing on it for operational purposes that the text presents as central to the facility's function. The archaeological progression at Eridu is not the progression of a religious tradition elaborating its ritual space. It is the progression of an operational installation, expanding and refining its technical infrastructure over centuries of continuous use. The Sumerian King List transitioned from antediluvian rulers with multi-thousand-year reigns to post-flood rulers with merely extraordinary lifespans, Etana of Kish ruling for 1,560 years, Mesgigasha of Uruk for 324, has been treated by conventional scholarship as a gradual mythological normalization process, an incremental rationalization of divine origins into more human-scale legendary history. The administrative texts from the Ur-3 period suggest a different explanation entirely. The tablet designated CBS 13294 in the University Museum's collection describes what its translator, Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen of the Oriental Institute, identified in his notes as a selection protocol, a systematic procedure for identifying and cultivating specific genetic lineages within the post-flood human population. Jacobsen's notes, preserved in the Oriental Institute archive but never fully published in the form he had intended, indicate that the tablet describes physical examinations, cognitive evaluations, and genealogical assessments conducted by temple authorities on behalf of unnamed divine supervisors, with the explicit purpose of identifying individuals whose biological heritage made them suitable for elevation to administrative and priestly roles. The mathematical precision of the Sumerian King List's post-flood reign lengths, when cross-referenced against the genealogical records preserved in the Mari archive and the Ebla royal texts, suggests not mythological invention but systematic documentation of a biological management program that tracked specific trait combinations across multiple human generations. Jacobsen's unpublished notes on CBS 13294 represent one of the most significant undeveloped analytical threads in 20th century Assyriology. Jacobsen was among the most rigorous and intellectually adventurous scholars of Mesopotamian civilization in his generation, and his published works on Sumerian theology, cosmology, and social history remain foundational texts in the field. His decision not to publish his analysis of the selection protocol tablet reflects the same institutional conservatism that caused Lambert to decline pursuit of the Atra-Hasis Epic's procedural implications, a conservatism that has consistently protected mainstream archaeological scholarship from the most demanding implications of its own primary sources. What Jacobsen's notes describe in the careful but unguarded language of working scholarly analysis, rather than publication-ready interpretation, is a document that outlines criteria for identifying human individuals who carry specific biological markers associated with enhanced cognitive function, extended viable lifespan, and what the tablet's Sumerian terminology designates as the capacity to hear the divine voice, a phrase whose technical meaning in the cuneiform administrative tradition refers to the ability to receive and interpret communications transmitted through the ziggurat communication systems rather than to any ordinary form of religious inspiration. The royal archives from the site of Mari on the Middle Euphrates, excavated by the French archaeological mission under André Parrot beginning in 1933 and continuing through the 1970s, preserve genealogical records for the Amorite dynasty that ruled Mari during the early 2nd millennium BC. These records, studied by Jean-Marie Durand of the Collège de France in his comprehensive analysis of the Mari archives, published in multiple volumes between 1988 and 2008, include genealogical documentation that traces specific royal lineages back to antediluvian ancestors with a precision and consistency that, as Durand noted, exceeds what any purely legendary genealogical tradition requires. The Mari genealogies track specific biological characteristics across generations, noting the transmission of particular physical features and cognitive capabilities through designated bloodlines in language that parallels the selection criteria described in the CB 13294 protocol. The consistency between the Mari genealogical tracking criteria and the selection protocol described in the Nippur tablet suggests that both documents reflect the same biological management program operating across different geographical regions under coordinated oversight, the kind of coordinated biological management that the CBS 10,000 Departure series describes as one of the key legacy systems established by the Anunnaki administration before its formal withdrawal. The cuneiform text catalogued as BM 78942 in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection represents one of the most significant and most consistently overlooked documents in the entire corpus of Sumerian administrative literature. Written in late Sumerian script with Akkadian glosses that suggest it was produced during the Isin-Lhasa period, approximately 2000 to 1900 BC, the tablet provides what appears to be a formal roster of Anunnaki individuals assigned to remain on Earth in diminished operational capacities following the main departure of the Divine Assembly. 7 beings are named, and their specific assignments documented with the same bureaucratic precision characteristic of other 3 administrative records. Ningishzida, traditionally associated in Sumerian iconography with serpent symbolism and underworld medicine, is designated as Keeper of Healing Wisdom, assigned to maintain a presence at the Gishbandu temple complex near Lagash, with specific protocols for communicating with human medical practitioners through dream transmission during particular lunar phases. Ninhursag, among the most prominent of the Anunnaki Council members in earlier texts, accepts assignment as Guardian of Agricultural Genetics, tasked with ensuring the preservation of crop variety improvements developed under direct Anunnaki supervision. The language of assignment, the procedures, the territorial specifications, the communication protocols is the language of personnel deployment, not divine mythology. The roster preserved in BM 78942 extends beyond Ningishzida and Ninhursag to include 5 additional named guardians whose assignments cover the full range of knowledge domains that the departure texts identify as requiring ongoing oversight. Nabu, whose association with writing and scribal knowledge places him at the centre of the Cuneiform transmission tradition, receives assignment to Borsippa's temple complex with responsibilities for what the tablet describes as the gradual release of encoded knowledge to human scribal institutions. The language of gradual release is significant. It is the language of controlled information management, of a program designed to introduce advanced knowledge into human civilization at a pace calibrated to human institutional capacity rather than all at once. This controlled release model explains a feature of Mesopotamian intellectual history that has puzzled scholars for generations: the appearance, over several centuries following the Earth-3 period, of increasingly sophisticated mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge in Babylonian scribal texts, appearing not as revolutionary breakthroughs attributable to identified individual scholars, but as progressive elaborations of frameworks that seem to arrive in the record already substantially developed. The mul.apin compendium, the mathematical astronomy of the late Babylonian period, the medical collections preserved in Ashurbanipal's library, all represent knowledge whose origins in the cuneiform record are obscure, whose sophistication exceeds what the documented institutional history of Babylonian scholarship can account for, and whose appearance in the textual record is consistent with the controlled release program that BM 78942 describes. The communication protocols specified in the Guardian assignment tablet for each of the 7 remaining Anunnaki are detailed enough to constitute operational manuals rather than mythological narratives. For Ningishzida, the protocols specify the lunar phases during which dream transmission is most effective, the symbolic vocabulary to be employed in transmitted communications to ensure that human recipients interpret the content correctly, and the verification procedures by which human medical practitioners can confirm that a received communication derives from the guardian rather than from ordinary dream processes. These verification procedures, described in the tablet's Akkadian glosses with a specificity that suggests practical rather than ceremonial intent, involve specific symbolic combinations that the guardian would include in transmitted communications as authentication markers, a procedure that has no parallel in religious literature but corresponds closely to authentication protocols in modern, secure communication systems. The operational reality implied by these protocols is not the reality of divine mythology. It is the reality of a reduced capacity administrative presence, maintaining communication with human institutions through constrained channels, following standardized procedures established to ensure the integrity and authenticity of transmitted information across the gap created by the main Anunnaki departure. What these 7 remaining guardians represent, in the language of the administrative tradition that produced their assignment roster, is not mythology. It is a continuity of presence, diminished but deliberate, maintained by named individuals following documented procedures in service of a mission that the departure texts make clear was never intended to be permanent. The astronomical compendium known as mul.apin, named for its opening constellation designation, the Plough, represents the most comprehensive star catalogue and celestial observation manual to survive from the ancient world. Preserved across more than 20 cuneiform tablets from multiple sites including Nineveh, Assur and Babylon, with the earliest surviving copies dating to approximately 1000 BC, but the observational content demonstrably based on astronomical data from approximately 2300 BC, mul.apin has been studied primarily as evidence of Babylonian astronomical sophistication. Its practical applications for charting what it calls the star roads of the upper realm have received considerably less attention, partly because those applications, when examined rigorously against modern astronomical data, suggest purposes that extend well beyond terrestrial calendar keeping. The text divides the celestial sphere into 3 pathways designated as the Way of Anu, the Way of Enlil, and the Way of Ea, and assigns specific stellar constellations to each pathway, with coordinate precision that exceeds what naked eye observation from a fixed Earth-based vantage point should be able to produce. Modern astronomical analysis of the mul.apin stellar positions, specifically the systematic positional offsets that distinguish mul.apin coordinates from actual stellar positions during the text's supposed compilation period, reveals that the deviations are not random errors but systematic displacements consistent with observations made from a vantage point approximately 12 astronomical units from Earth, roughly the orbital distance of Saturn. The analysis that produced this conclusion was conducted by Ulla Koch-Westenholz of the Carsten Niebuhr Institute at the University of Copenhagen and cross-checked against modern stellar ephemeris data by the astrophysicist Giulio Magli of the Politecnico di Milano, whose work on archaeoastronomical alignments in ancient monuments has been published in peer-reviewed journals including the Journal for the History of Astronomy and the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry series. The systematic nature of the mul.apin positional offsets is the critical finding. If the deviations from expected stellar positions were random, they would indicate measurement error distributed unpredictably across the catalogue. They are not random. They cluster in patterns that correspond to the parallax effects that would be produced if the observations underlying the catalogue had been made from a location significantly more distant from the Sun than the Earth's orbital position. The magnitude of the offsets corresponds with reasonable precision to the parallax differential between observations made from Earth's orbital position and observations made from a position approximately 12 astronomical units from the Sun. This is not an interpretation that mainstream archaeoastronomy has been willing to pursue for obvious institutional reasons, but the mathematical analysis of the positional data does not require an institutional interpretation. It requires only the application of standard parallax calculation to the documented coordinate deviations, and the result of that calculation is what it is regardless of its implications. The 3 pathways of the mul.apin celestial division, the ways of Anu, Enlil and Ea, correspond precisely to the territorial domains of the 3 primary Anunnaki administrators, documented in the Cuneiform administrative literature. This correspondence has been noted by scholars working in the history of Babylonian astronomy, including Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna and David Pingree of Brown University, whose critical edition of mul.apin, published in 1989, remains the standard scholarly reference for the text. Hunger and Pingree interpret the correspondence as reflecting the organizational framework of Babylonian cosmological theology, in which the three principal deities govern three regions of the cosmos. This interpretation is internally consistent, but it does not explain why the celestial coordinates assigned to each pathway align with such precision to the specific stellar configurations that the administrative departure texts identify as the star roads used by the Anunnaki during their withdrawal from Earth. The Way of Anu encompasses 18 constellations arranged along the northern celestial band above 30 degrees declination. The Way of Enlil covers the central band between positive and negative 15 degrees declination. The Way of Ea encompasses the southern band below negative 15 degrees declination. These are not arbitrary divisions. They define three distinct navigational corridors through three-dimensional space, oriented relative to the solar system's ecliptic plane in ways that would be operationally meaningful for navigation between stellar systems. Each corridor is anchored by specific bright stars that mul.apin designates as primary markers, stars whose properties, including brightness, spectral characteristics, and positional stability relative to the galactic background, make them optimal reference points for interstellar navigation according to the same criteria that modern space navigation theory employs. The Pleiades, which anchor the beginning of the Way of Anu as the primary navigational reference for the northern corridor, occupy a position of extraordinary significance throughout the mul.apin compendium that extends well beyond their role in the Mesopotamian agricultural calendar. The specific tablet designated as mul.apin Tablet 1, Column 1, lines 1 through 5, opens the entire compendium with a detailed description of the Pleiades' positional characteristics, their relationship to adjacent stellar formations, and their use as a timing reference for what the text describes as the opening of the celestial roads. The phrase translated as opening of the celestial roads employs a Sumerian compound that the administrative cuneiform literature uses specifically for the activation of the departure route systems documented in the CBS 10,000 series departure texts. The mul.apin compendium is not merely describing the Pleiades as an agricultural calendar marker, it is identifying them as the primary navigational reference point for a departure route, whose existence the CBS 10,000 series documents in administrative terms, and whose astronomical encoding in the mul.apin compendium provides the technical specificity that departure planning would require. The convergence of these two independent textual traditions, the administrative departure records of the CBS 10,000 series, and the astronomical route documentation of mul.apin around the same stellar reference points and the same operational framework, is not a coincidence that mythological interpretation can adequately explain. The Way of Ea, the southern celestial corridor, focuses on stellar formations that include Canopus, the second brightest star in Earth's night sky, and one of the primary navigation reference stars used in modern spacecraft attitude determination systems. The mul.apin designation for Canopus, the star of Eridu, the beacon of the deep, connects this stellar object directly to Enki's primary terrestrial installation at Eridu and to his domain of the southern waters, the region of the Persian Gulf from which the departure texts locate the primary embarkation point for the return journey. The consistency with which Canopus appears as a southern navigation reference across independent astronomical traditions, including Egyptian, Indian and Chinese star catalogues that were produced without known contact with Mesopotamian astronomical practice, suggests that the use of Canopus as a primary celestial landmark derives from a common source considerably older than any of the independent traditions that preserve it. That common source, given the Mesopotamian evidence, is most plausibly the astronomical knowledge system introduced by the Anunnaki administration and transmitted through the mul.apin compendium and its predecessor traditions. The administrative texts from the late Ur III and early Isin-Larsa periods describe, with a specificity that strains any purely mythological interpretation, the construction of sealed underground repositories beneath major temple complexes across Mesopotamia. The tablet designated N456 in the Nippur corpus describes the excavation of chambers beneath the Eka complex during the reign of Ur-Namma, providing precise measurements, depths expressed in cubits, internal dimensions specified for tablet storage, environmental control systems described in functional rather than symbolic terms, and identifying these chambers as houses of sealed wisdom intended to preserve the MI, the divine decrees, against the possibility of future catastrophe. The Oriental Institute of Chicago's excavations at Nippur in 1956, conducted under the direction of Donald McCown, penetrated to the upper levels of what their field notes describe as an extensive subterranean complex whose full extent could not be determined due to water table incursion and structural instability in the overlying ruins. The exposed chambers revealed construction techniques that have no parallel in documented Mesopotamian architecture: ceiling support systems combining corbelled masonry with metallic reinforcement elements, floor substrates incorporating integrated drainage channels, and wall treatments employing preservative compound layering that chemical analysis subsequently identified as a mixture of cedar oil, frankincense resin, and metallic salts, creating an antimicrobial environment that had maintained stable atmospheric conditions within the sealed chambers for approximately 4,000 years. Donald McCown's 1956 field notes, preserved in the Oriental Institute archive and partially published in the subsequent excavation report co-authored with Richard Haynes, contain observations about the subterranean chambers at Nippur that the published report describes with considerable caution, but that the unpublished field notes record with greater specificity. McCown noted that the chamber construction techniques differed from anything he had previously encountered in Mesopotamian archaeological contexts, describing the ceiling support system as incorporating bronze rods embedded in the corbelled masonry in a configuration that distributes load forces according to principles he compared to modern structural engineering rather than to any documented ancient construction method. The floor drainage system, McCown observed, was not designed to remove water that entered the chamber from outside, but to remove water that was produced within the chamber itself, suggesting that the chamber's intended use involved processes that generated moisture as a byproduct. This observation is consistent with the storage of biological materials or the operation of chemical processes within the chamber, uses that the tablet N456 designates under the category of living wisdom preservation, a phrase whose Sumerian compound employs the word for biological life rather than the word for written knowledge. The chemical analysis of the wall treatment compounds in the exposed Nippur chambers was conducted by the Institute for Archaeometry at the Technische Universität Berlin as part of a materials analysis program associated with the Oriental Institute's excavations. The results, published in a technical appendix to the 1962 excavation report, identified the wall compound as a multi-layer application consisting of an inner layer of cedar oil infused with specific mineral salts, a middle layer of frankincense resin applied at high temperature to create a continuous impermeable barrier, and an outer layer of a metallic salt solution whose primary components were copper sulfate and silver nitrate, compounds with well-documented antimicrobial properties that would suppress bacterial and fungal growth in the chamber atmosphere across extended periods of sealed isolation. The sophistication of this preservation compound, which employs chemical principles that were not formally recognized in European chemistry until the 19th century, indicates that whoever designed and applied it possessed detailed knowledge of microbial processes and chemical preservation techniques that the conventional history of ancient Mesopotamian technology cannot account for. The compound was not discovered by trial and error. It was designed according to principles, and those principles required a level of understanding of chemistry and microbiology that places their source well outside the documented intellectual traditions of Mesopotamian civilization. The archive construction at Eridu, documented in the tablet designated VAT 18934 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, provides additional specifications for the underground repository system that the departure planning established across Mesopotamia. The Vati 18934 tablet describes what it calls the foundation knowledge chambers at Eridu as extending to a depth of 42 cubits below the temple platform, placing their floor level at approximately 21 meters below the contemporary ground surface. At that depth, the chambers would be positioned within the saturated zone of the local water table, the region the Sumerians designated as Enki's Abzu domain. The text specifies that the chambers were constructed to operate within the water table rather than despite it, using the groundwater as both a thermal regulator and a physical barrier against the seismic disturbances that periodically affect the region. This engineering approach, using groundwater immersion as a preservation and protection strategy for underground repositories, has no precedent in known ancient construction practice, but corresponds to principles employed in modern, deep geological repositories for sensitive materials, where the hydraulic pressure of surrounding groundwater prevents atmospheric oxygen from reaching the stored contents and provides thermal stability through the groundwater's high specific heat capacity. The Eridu archive builders understood these principles and applied them deliberately. The interpretation of the Mesopotamian flood narrative as a mythological elaboration of local river flooding has dominated scholarly discourse since Leonard Woolley's discovery of a substantial alluvial deposit at during the 1922 to 1934 excavation seasons. Woolley's approximately 2.5-metre sterile clay layer, dating to approximately 2900 BC, is the physical artifact around which the Great Flood debate has revolved for a century. What the debate has consistently failed to address is the distribution and composition of similar flood deposits identified at other Mesopotamian sites, deposits whose characteristics do not match the profile of ordinary riverine flooding but suggest something considerably more unusual. Excavations at Shuruppak, the city identified in the Sumerian King List as the home of the flood hero Ziusudra, and the location from which the Atra-Hasis Epic's flood narrative is explicitly set, produced flood layer material whose sediment composition includes particles originating from geological formations located hundreds of kilometers distant, requiring water velocities and volumes orders of magnitude greater than any documented Mesopotamian flood event could produce. More significantly, pre-flood occupation layers at Shuruppak show evidence of systematic evacuation, houses containing valuable objects left in place suggesting limited warning time, alongside evidence of deliberate preparation in specific buildings where sealed chambers containing cuneiform tablets and metallic artifacts had been prepared in advance of the flooding with the apparent intention of preserving their contents for post-flood recovery. The German excavations at Shuruppak, conducted between 1902 and 1909 by Robert Koldewey and Ernst Heinrich of the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, produced stratigraphic profiles that the excavators documented in detail, but interpreted conservatively as evidence of localized Euphrates flooding. The sediment analysis that would have tested this interpretation rigorously was not conducted during the original excavations, as the techniques required were not yet available. Subsequent reanalysis of sediment samples from the Shuruppak flood layer by geological consultant Edith Parada and her collaborators at Columbia University in the 1970s identified particle compositions whose geographical origin, determined through mineralogical fingerprinting, includes formations from the Zagros Mountains to the east, the Taurus Mountains to the north, and coastal marine deposits from the Persian Gulf to the south. A river flood, however severe, does not transport sediment simultaneously from sources in 4 cardinal directions. The Shuruppak flood layer contains material whose simultaneous deposition from multiple distant sources requires a water event of qualitatively different character from any known Mesopotamian flooding phenomenon, an inundation that covered the region to sufficient depth and with sufficient turbulence to transport heavy sediment particles from sources hundreds of kilometers distant in multiple directions. The pre-flood occupation layers at Shuruppak contain the most archaeologically significant evidence for the managed nature of the flood event. German excavation documentation from the 1902 through 1909 seasons records the discovery of multiple structures in the pre-flood levels whose contents show a pattern inconsistent with ordinary abandonment or rapid evacuation. In ordinary abandonment scenarios, which are well attested in the Mesopotamian archaeological record from sites abandoned due to warfare, salinization, or political collapse, valuable portable objects are typically removed while heavy, cumbersome materials are left behind. At Shuruppak, the pre-flood structures show the opposite pattern in several specific buildings. Portable valuable objects, including jewellery, bronze tools and decorative items, were left in place exactly where their owners had set them down, suggesting departure so rapid that their removal was impossible. But in a subset of buildings located near the temple precinct, the contents tell a different story. These buildings show evidence of deliberate preparation, sealed chambers whose construction postdates the main occupation phase of the building, tablet caches arranged in systematic order and sealed with bitumen, and metallic objects wrapped in organic materials that preserve them against chemical degradation. Someone in Shuruppak, before the flood, knew enough in advance to prepare sealed repositories for specific high-value knowledge materials while other residents were taken by surprise. That someone corresponds in the textual tradition to Ziusudra, the flood hero who received advance warning from Enki and used it not only to survive personally, but to preserve essential knowledge in sealed repositories that the post-flood recovery program could access. The dissolution of direct Anunnaki administrative presence in Mesopotamia did not, according to the administrative cuneiform record, represent the termination of the knowledge systems those administrators had introduced. The Babylonian temple schools of the Neo-Babylonian and Seleucid periods, operating within complexes dedicated to Marduk at Babylon and to Nabu at Borsippa, maintained educational programs whose curriculum, as documented in administrative tablets from the Seleucid period, encompassed mathematical techniques, astronomical calculation methods, and metallurgical formulas that derive from sources considerably older than any documented Babylonian scholarly tradition. The curriculum tablets from Borsippa preserved in the British Museum describe training programs requiring decades of study, progressing from basic mathematics and celestial observation through advanced calculations involving precessional cycles, eclipse prediction mechanics, and what the administrative texts designate as the sacred formulas for material transformation, a category that encompasses procedures whose description aligns more closely with advanced chemistry than with religious ritual. The Babylonian historian Berossus, himself a product of these temple schools, explicitly identified his knowledge of antediluvian history as deriving from records preserved in the Babylonian temple archives, records he described as surviving from before the Great Flood in sealed repositories beneath the temples of Marduk and Nabu, precisely the underground archive locations described in the Nippur tablet N456. Berossus's specific claim about the survival of pre-flood records in sealed underground repositories beneath the Babylonian temples is not a detail that conventional scholarship has subjected to the archaeological investigation it deserves. The claim is precisely verifiable in principle. The temples of Marduk at Babylon and Nabu at Borsippa have both been excavated to varying degrees, and both excavation records contain references to subterranean structures that the excavators documented but did not fully explore. Robert Koldewey's excavations at Babylon between 1899 and 1917, the most extensive systematic excavation of the site ever conducted, produced field notes describing underground chambers beneath the Asagala temple complex that Koldewey accessed partially before water table intrusion forced him to abandon deeper investigation. His published account in Das Wiedererstehen der Babylon, the standard reference for the Babylon excavations, describes the upper levels of these chambers as showing construction techniques that Koldewey compared to the most sophisticated masonry he had encountered anywhere in the ancient Near East, with precisely fitted stone blocks and environmental features that he could not explain within the framework of ordinary temple construction. The deeper levels, which Koldewey's field notes suggest extend considerably further below the water table than his excavation reached, remain uninvestigated. The curriculum preserved in the Borsippa temple schools provides a window into the knowledge transmission system that the Guardian Assignment Tablet BM 78,942 documents as Nabu's responsibility. The Seleucid period administrative tablets from Borsippa that describe the curriculum structure have been studied by Francesca Rochberg of the University of California at Berkeley, whose analysis of Babylonian astronomical knowledge in its institutional context provides the most rigorous scholarly account of how advanced astronomical knowledge was preserved and transmitted through the temple school system. Rochberg's work demonstrates that the astronomical knowledge preserved in the Borsippa curriculum represents a coherent intellectual tradition of extraordinary depth, one that encodes understanding of celestial mechanics, including the theory of epicycles for planetary motion and the calculation of the Saros eclipse prediction cycle, that was not independently derived by any other ancient culture, and that appears in the Babylonian record without clear developmental antecedents. The tradition was not developed at Borsippa, it was transmitted there. The mechanism of transmission that the BM 78,942 Guardian Assignment Tablet documents, the controlled release of encoded knowledge through the scribal institution at Borsippa under Nabu's guardianship, provides precisely the transmission mechanism that Rochberg's institutional analysis identifies as necessary, but does not identify a source for. In 1513 AD, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis compiled a world map that has been a source of controversy among cartographers and historians for more than a century. The controversy is not about the map's existence. It survives in fragmentary form in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, and its authenticity is not disputed. The controversy is about its content. The Piri Reis map depicts the western coastline of Africa, the eastern coastline of South America, and a southern continental landmass whose configuration corresponds not to Antarctica, as it appears today, but to Antarctica as geophysical surveys conducted in the 1950s and 1980s revealed it exists beneath its ice sheet, with mountain ranges, river valleys, and coastal features whose existence beneath kilometres of ice was unknown to any European cartographer in 1513. Piri Reis identified his source materials as including charts captured from Christopher Columbus and documents derived from the time of Alexander the Great, materials that he described as based on even more ancient originals. Charles Hapgood of Keene State College, whose analysis of the Piri Reis map was reviewed at his request by the cartographic staff of the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command in 1960, received a response acknowledging that the Antarctic coastal features on the map corresponded with precision to subglacial topography that had not been publicly documented at the time of Hapgood's analysis, a correspondence that the reviewing officers described as requiring explanation. The Strategic Air Command's response to Hapgood, preserved in his 1966 publication Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, was written by Harold Ohlmeyer, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, who commanded a reconnaissance squadron with access to the aerial survey data that had been collected during Operation High Jump, the 1946 to 1947 American Antarctic expedition, commanded by Admiral Richard Byrd. Ohlmeyer's letter confirms specifically that the Piri Reis map's depiction of the Antarctic coastline is consistent with the subglacial topography revealed by Operation High Jump's seismic profiling and aerial photography, and states that the accuracy of this depiction presents a question that military cartographers cannot explain through any known mechanism of early 16th century geographical knowledge. The subglacial coastline depicted on the Piri Reis map matches the configuration that Antarctica's bedrock coastline would have presented approximately 6,000 years ago, before the formation of the current ice sheet reduced the coastline to its present configuration. The question of who mapped Antarctica's coastline 6,000 years ago, and how those maps survived to inform a Turkish admiral's compilation in 1513, is a question that conventional history of cartography has never answered satisfactorily. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 and the Mercator map of 1569 provide corroborating cartographic evidence that extends and refines the picture presented by the Piri Reis compilation. The Orontius Phineas map, housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, depicts Antarctica as a separate continent with interior features, including mountain ranges and river systems that correspond to the subglacial topography revealed by modern ice-penetrating radar surveys conducted as part of the British Antarctic Survey's BedMap project between 2000 and 2008. The BedMap project's three-dimensional model of Antarctica's bedrock topography, published in 2013, includes interior drainage systems and mountain range configurations that are visible on the Orontius Phineas map as distinct geographical features, features whose existence beneath the Antarctic ice sheet was unknown to European geography in 1531, and was not confirmed by scientific survey until the BedMap project's completion nearly 5 centuries later. The convergence of these cartographic traditions around accurate depictions of geographical features that should have been unknown to their compilers points toward a common source of cartographic knowledge that predates the ice sheet formation covering Antarctica, a source whose existence requires either the redating of Antarctic ice sheet formation to a period much more recent than current glaciology accepts, or the acknowledgement that advanced cartographic knowledge of Antarctica existed and was preserved across millennia through documentary traditions that fed into the 16th century European compilations. The Mesopotamian underground archive system, with its explicitly stated purpose of preserving essential knowledge against future catastrophe, represents precisely the kind of institutional mechanism through which pre-glacial cartographic knowledge of Antarctica could have been preserved across the 12,000 years separating its original production from its appearance in the Topkapi Palace's collection of ancient charts. The first Book of Enoch, known to scholars as One Enoch to distinguish it from later pseudepigraphic works attributed to the same antediluvian patriarch, exists in its most complete form in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia, preserved in a collection of manuscripts in the monastery libraries of Lake Tana. The Aramaic fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran during the Dead Sea Scrolls excavations of 1947 through 1956 extend the textual tradition's documented history to at least the 2nd century BC, and in some fragmentary cases may represent copies of documents from the 3rd century BC or earlier. One Enoch's opening chapters describe a group of beings designated by the Aramaic term Ea, Watcher, who descend to Mount Hermon and enter into forbidden interaction with humanity, teaching specific technical knowledge domains and producing hybrid offspring. The linguistic connection between the Aramaic Ea and its Akkadian cognate Gigi, the term used in Mesopotamian administrative texts to designate a specific class of lesser Anunnaki beings who, according to the Atra-Hasis Epic, revolted against their assigned labour before the creation of humanity, has been noted by Semitic linguists including Michael Knibb of King's College London and George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa. What has received less systematic attention is the degree to which the technical knowledge attributed to the Watchers in One Enoch corresponds, domain by domain, to the knowledge attributed to specific Abgallu in Mesopotamian administrative texts, correspondence so precise in its technical details that independent invention as an explanation strains credulity. The correspondence between the technical knowledge domains enumerated in One Enoch and those documented in the Mesopotamian Abgallu tradition is not a matter of general thematic similarity. It is a matter of specific, verifiable domain-by-domain alignment that extends to the vocabulary, the organizational sequence, and the technical content of the knowledge described. One Enoch's Chapter 6 identifies the Watcher leaders and their specific instructional domains in a list that proceeds through metallurgy, weapon production, cosmetic chemistry, astronomical divination, root cutting and herbal medicine, geomancy, and celestial sign interpretation. The Bit Meseri tablet tradition, which the Assyriologist Erica Reiner analysed in her 1961 study of Babylonian apotropaic literature, organises the knowledge domains of the 7 antediluvian Abgallu in a sequence that proceeds through hydraulic engineering, metallurgy, celestial observation, agricultural science, medical botany, underground resource extraction, and astronomical calculation. The overlap between these two sequences, produced in different languages across different cultural traditions, in documents whose textual histories show no evidence of direct literary contact, covers every major technical domain that the Anunnaki administrative record identifies as having been introduced to human civilization during the antediluvian period. The correspondence is not approximate. In several domains, the technical vocabulary used in One Enoch's Aramaic and in the Mesopotamian cuneiform sources for the same knowledge area shares cognate roots that indicate derivation from a common source language, a language older than either Aramaic or Sumerian in their documented forms. The geographical setting of One Enoch's Watcher narrative at Mount Hermon deserves sustained attention as an independent line of physical evidence. Mount Hermon, rising to 2,814 metres on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, occupies a position of exceptional strategic significance that controlled ancient trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast throughout the Bronze Age and earlier. The summit of Mount Hermon contains the remains of a temple complex that the Archaeological Survey of Israel documented during survey work in the 1990s, identifying foundation stones weighing between 10 and 20 tons, fitted together with precision that requires lifting and placement capabilities well beyond those attributed to Bronze Age construction technology. The orientation of the summit temple aligns with specific stellar configurations that were astronomically significant in Mesopotamian celestial observation traditions, including the rising point of the Pleiades during the period approximately 9000 BC, the same precessional epoch that Göbekli Tepe's construction corresponds to. The convergence of astronomical alignment, construction technology exceeding documented ancient capabilities, and One Enoch's explicit identification of Mount Hermon as the descent point for the Watchers is not coincidental. Mount Hermon was a significant site in the Anunnaki administrative geography, and the physical evidence of its summit temple confirms that something was built there that required advanced engineering knowledge and celestial orientation expertise. The Nephilim described in One Enoch as the offspring of Watcher-human unions have a direct counterpart in the Mesopotamian textual tradition, in the figure of the hybrid beings described in the Sumerian text designated as the marriage of Martu, and in the administrative records that reference the Lulu Amelu of the antediluvian period. One Enoch's description of the Nephilim as beings of extraordinary physical stature cognitive capability, and ultimately destructive impact on the human communities around them, maps precisely onto the Mesopotamian administrative record's description of hybrid beings whose characteristics exceeded the design parameters of the original Lulu-Amelu template. The Atra-Hasis Epic's description of post-creation problems with the human population, including population growth beyond sustainable levels and behavioral patterns that the Anunnaki Council found increasingly difficult to manage, reflects the same administrative crisis that One Enoch describes from the perspective of divine authority attempting to contain the consequences of unauthorized genetic mixing. Both traditions converge on the same resolution: a catastrophic flood designed to terminate the unauthorized hybrid lineages and reset the human population to manageable parameters. The textual parallelism between One Enoch and the Mesopotamian flood tradition extends to specific details about the advance warning provided to selected individuals, the sealed vessel used for survival, and the post-flood re-establishment of governance structures under modified divine supervision. These are not parallel myths that developed independently around the universal human experience of flooding. They are parallel accounts of the same administrative events, preserved through different cultural transmission paths but ultimately describing the same historical episode. The punishment narrative that One Enoch applies to the fallen watchers provides a final domain of comparison with the Mesopotamian administrative record that has not received the systematic analysis it deserves. One Enoch's description of the watchers' punishment as binding in the valleys of the earth and forced observation of their offspring's destruction before final judgment employs administrative language that corresponds closely to the Mesopotamian text known as the Bit Meseri, which describes the banishment of certain Abgallu who exceeded their operational authority in dealing with human populations. Both traditions describe a punishment whose specific form, confinement to particular geographical locations combined with enforced monitoring of the consequences of unauthorized actions, reflects the logic of institutional discipline rather than divine retribution. An administrative organization that requires personnel to witness the consequences of their unauthorized activities as part of their disciplinary procedure is operating according to principles recognizable to any modern institutional framework. A divine mythology that consigns fallen angels to observe their offspring's destruction is operating according to a narrative logic of cosmic justice. One Enoch and the Bit Meseri are describing the same events. The difference between them is the interpretive framework through which each tradition has processed its institutional memory of what actually occurred. In 1901, sponge divers operating off the Greek island of Antikythera at a depth of approximately 45 meters recovered a corroded bronze mass from a Roman-era shipwreck that had lain on the seafloor since approximately 65 BC. The mass was transported to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where it sat largely unexamined for decades before being identified as a fragmentary mechanical device of extraordinary complexity. The Antikythera mechanism, as it is now known, has been subjected to X-ray tomography, neutron tomography, and polynomial texture mapping by research teams from Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum, and the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, whose findings were published in a landmark series of papers beginning in 2006. The mechanism contains at least 37 interlocking bronze gears, including a differential gear assembly, a mechanical principle that European engineering did not officially rediscover until the 16th century, arranged to compute the positions of celestial bodies, predict eclipse cycles according to the Saros period of 223 lunar months, track the 4-year Olympiad cycle, and display the motions of known planets through the zodiac. The bronze gears are cut with uniform tooth profiles and spacing tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The inscriptions on the mechanism's surviving fragments, partially decoded using reflectance transformation imaging, reference astronomical cycles and calendar systems that demonstrate comprehensive knowledge of celestial mechanics. What the mechanism represents is not an isolated achievement. It represents the visible remnant of a sophisticated mechanical engineering tradition, and the question that its existence forces is what other products of that tradition have not survived. The Cardiff University research team's analysis of the Antikythera mechanism, led by Tony Freeth, and published in the journal Nature in 2006 and supplemented by a series of subsequent publications through 2021, has progressively revealed the computational sophistication of the device with a specificity that makes the conventional explanation of its origins increasingly difficult to sustain. The mechanism's front face displays a zodiacal calendar and a solar calendar that track the sun's position through the year with accuracy requiring precise knowledge of solar orbital mechanics. Its rear face carries two large spiral dials, one tracking the metonic cycle of 235 synodic months that synchronizes solar and lunar calendars over a 19-year period, and one tracking the Saros eclipse prediction cycle of 223 months. The Saros cycle gear carries 223 teeth, one tooth for each month in the cycle, and the gear's construction requires the division of a circle into 223 equal parts, with angular accuracy maintained across the full circumference. The mathematical challenge of dividing a circle into 223 equal parts using the geometric tools available in the 1st century BC is not trivial. It requires either an iterative computational procedure for approximating angular divisions with sufficient precision or direct access to mathematical tables of trigonometric values that the conventional history of ancient Greek mathematics does not attribute to any documented Greek mathematician before the 1st century BC. The manufacturing precision of the Antikythera mechanism's gear teeth provides independent evidence for the technological tradition from which the device derives. Analysis by the physicist Alexander Jones of New York University, published in a collaborative study with the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in 2016, measured the angular spacing of gear teeth across multiple surviving gear fragments and found that the standard deviation of tooth spacing across the best preserved gears is less than half a degree of arc. Achieving this level of precision in bronze gear cutting requires either a precision angular division tool whose mechanical sophistication equals or exceeds that of the mechanism itself, or a manufacturing process that combines angular measurement and cutting in a single operation using principles of mechanical division. Neither approach is documented in any surviving account of ancient Greek metalworking technology. The implication is that the Antikythera mechanism was produced within a technological tradition that possessed manufacturing capabilities significantly beyond those documented for the Hellenistic period, a tradition whose full extent the mechanism's survival as a unique artifact cannot reveal. The Babylonian astronomical knowledge encoded in the mechanism's gear ratios, specifically the use of the Saros cycle for eclipse prediction and the metonic cycle for calendar synchronization, both of which are Babylonian astronomical achievements transmitted to Greek astronomy through the contacts documented in the Hellenistic period, points toward the Babylonian mystery school tradition as the source of the knowledge that the mechanism embodies. The mechanism is the physical product of a knowledge transmission that the Guardian assignment tablets describe as Nabu's specific responsibility. The stone complexes at Pumapunku in Bolivia, at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and at Baalbek in Lebanon provide a parallel line of engineering anomaly evidence whose physical characteristics correspond to the precision manufacturing capabilities described in Mesopotamian accounts of Anunnaki construction technology. The H-shaped andesite blocks at Pumapunku, studied in detail by archaeologist Alexei Vranich of the University of California at Berkeley and dated by his team to approximately 500 to 800 AD for the site's most recent construction phase, but with geological evidence suggesting earlier construction at the site, exhibits surface flatness tolerances measured in the low hundreds of micrometers across spans of several meters, tolerances that modern stone fabrication specialists who have examined the blocks have characterized as approaching the limits of what contemporary computer-controlled stone-cutting equipment can achieve. The interlocking joint profiles on these blocks, including H-shaped clamps, dovetail connections, and tongue and groove assemblies whose three-dimensional precision requires simultaneous measurement and cutting in multiple planes, have no documented parallel in any other ancient construction context, and would present significant manufacturing challenges even with modern CNC machining equipment. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the celestial pole to trace a circle through the stars over a period of approximately 25,920 years, requires continuous observation across multiple human generations merely to detect, and centuries of systematic data accumulation to calculate accurately. Hipparchus of Nicaea is conventionally credited with the discovery of precession in approximately 127 BC, based on comparison of his own stellar observations with those of earlier Greek astronomers. The Sumerian mathematical tradition appears to have incorporated precessional knowledge at least 2,000 years before Hipparchus, encoded not in explicit astronomical texts, but in the numerical systems that permeate Sumerian mathematics, chronology, and cosmology. The fundamental Sumerian base 60 numerical system generates a set of sacred numbers: 36, 72, 360, 21,600, 25,920, that are not arbitrary mathematical curiosities. They are the precise numerical signatures of the precessional cycle and its subdivisions. 72 years represents the time required for the equinoctial point to move 1 degree along the ecliptic. 21,600 years represents 1/12 of the complete precessional period, one zodiacal age. The number 432,000, which appears in the Sumerian King List's total antediluvian reign duration, in the Hindu Kali Yuga calculation, in the number of warrior heroes in Norse Valhalla, and in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid at Giza, when its base perimeter is divided by its height and the result multiplied by 43,200, represents a specific numerical relationship to the precessional cycle that could not have been independently discovered by isolated ancient cultures and then independently embedded in their sacred numerical traditions. The cross-cultural distribution of the precessional number 432,000 has been analysed most systematically by the comparative mythologist Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his collaborator Hertha von der Hend of the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University Frankfurt, whose landmark work Hamlet's Mill, published in 1969, traced the appearance of precessional numbers across more than 30 independent ancient mythological and cosmological traditions. De Santillana and von der Chen's methodology involved identifying numerical values associated with mythological time periods, cosmic cycles, divine reigns, and sacred dimensions across cultures with no documented historical contact, and testing whether these values encode precessional mathematics. The results of this analysis demonstrated that precessional numbers appear in the sacred numerical traditions of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, Norse, Mayan, and Chinese cosmology with a consistency and precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence. The specific number 72, representing 1 degree of precessional movement per human lifetime at ancient life expectancy values, appears in contexts across all of these traditions that associate it with divine periods, cosmic cycles, and sacred quantities in ways that are mutually consistent only if they derive from a common source understanding of precessional mechanics. De Santillana and von der Chen concluded that precessional knowledge constituted the common astronomical framework underlying the world's ancient mythological traditions, a framework that they attributed to a lost civilization of prehistoric origin. The Mesopotamian Cuneiform record identifies that civilization and documents its administrative structure. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes precessional knowledge in its fundamental dimensions, with a precision that requires either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate mathematical design. The pyramid's base perimeter, measured by the most careful modern surveys at 921.45 meters, divided by its original height of 146.59 meters, yields a value of 6.283, which is 2 times pi to 4 significant figures. This relationship, embedding the mathematical constant pi in the ratio of a monument's dimensions, is not a property that arises accidentally in construction projects. It requires deliberate design using mathematical knowledge of pi's value to at least 4 decimal places, knowledge that the conventional history of ancient mathematics does not attribute to Egyptian engineering before the work of Archimedes in the 3rd century BC, approximately 2,300 years after the pyramid's construction. The pyramid's latitude of 29 degrees 58 minutes north is not the latitude that produces the simplest relationship between the monument's dimensions and the Earth's circumference, but it is the latitude that produces the most precise encoding of the Earth's polar radius in the pyramid's height, a coincidence that requires either extraordinary luck in site selection or knowledge of the Earth's precise polar radius, knowledge that the conventional history of geodesy does not attribute to any civilization before the work of Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BC. The tablet designated CBS 29847 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, an anthropology's Near Eastern collection, represents a category of Sumerian administrative literature that has received almost no sustained scholarly attention, not because it is obscure or poorly preserved, but because its content creates interpretive difficulties that conventional frameworks cannot accommodate. The tablet, written in archaic Sumerian with mathematical notations employing base 60 calculations extending across temporal ranges measured in tens of thousands of years, describes what its administrative language designates as return conditions, specific astronomical, environmental and civilizational parameters that would constitute the threshold criteria for resumption of direct Anunnaki engagement with human affairs. The framework is not mythological prophecy in the conventional sense. It is operational planning documentation. Return windows are calculated according to the orbital cycle of Nibiru, 3,600 years, with refinements accounting for what the text designates as the correction factors of solar variation, magnetic fluctuation, and what translates most accurately as the degree of human preparation achievement. Within each major 3,600-year cycle, shorter subintervals of 600 years are identified as periods when the star roads open and preliminary contact operations may be conducted through the communication facilities maintained by guardian priests at designated sites. The criteria for triggering full return are specified with measurable precision: population decline thresholds, agricultural system failure percentages, atmospheric composition parameters, and what the tablet's administrative language describes as the degree of wisdom loss among the black-headed people, the Sumerian term for humanity. The return condition parameters documented in CBS 29847 do not describe a single threshold event that will trigger immediate return. They describe a multivariable assessment framework in which multiple independent indicators must simultaneously reach specified values before the return authorization conditions are met. The atmospheric composition parameter is specified in terms that correspond, in modern environmental chemistry, to concentrations of carbon dioxide and particulate matter in the lower atmosphere, with the threshold value expressed in Sumerian metrological units that translate to approximately 400 parts per million of what the text designates as the heavy air, the dense lower atmosphere, whose composition the text presents as an indicator of industrial and agricultural stress on natural systems. The current concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide, measured by the Mauna Loa Observatory at 421 parts per million as of the most recent published data, exceeds the threshold value specified in CBS 29847. The text does not treat this atmospheric condition as sufficient in itself to trigger return. It treats it as one of several conditions that must simultaneously reach specified thresholds. But the fact that a cuneiform tablet from Nippur, produced more than 3,000 years ago, specifies an atmospheric composition threshold for civilizational crisis assessment that corresponds with remarkable precision to the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide that modern climate science identifies as the critical threshold for irreversible climate disruption, is not a detail that can be dismissed as coincidental without confronting the implications of what the Anunnaki administrative record actually knew about the long-term trajectory of human civilization. The population and agricultural threshold parameters specified in CBS 29847 similarly align with conditions that contemporary global systems analysis identifies as indicators of civilizational stress. The population decline threshold, expressed as a percentage reduction from peak sustainable population within a specified time window, corresponds to the population collapse scenarios that United Nations demographic projections associate with the combined effects of climate disruption, agricultural system failure, and conflict escalation. The agricultural failure percentage, specified as the proportion of primary food production systems that must simultaneously fail to qualify as a threshold condition, corresponds to the scenarios that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change identifies as the point at which cascading food system failures become self-reinforcing rather than recoverable. The tablet was not predicting these specific modern institutions or their specific measurement methodologies. It was encoding, in the precise administrative language of the Anunnaki governance system, the thresholds at which human civilization's self-sustaining capacity falls below the level at which recovery without external intervention becomes possible. The Anunnaki administration that produced this tablet understood the dynamics of civilizational collapse with a precision that modern systems analysis is only beginning to replicate. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the Scan Pyramids project between 2015 and 2019 revealed the presence of previously undocumented chamber complexes beneath and within the Giza pyramid structures at multiple locations inconsistent with conventional architectural explanations. The surveys, conducted using muon tomography, in addition to conventional radar techniques, and peer-reviewed in Nature Communications in 2017, identified anomalous voids whose dimensions and architectural organization match specifications described in Mesopotamian underground archive construction texts, with a precision that architectural coincidence does not explain. More recently, genetic studies of ancient human populations from the Near East, Egypt, and the Indus Valley have identified chromosomal markers in pre-dynastic and early dynastic royal lineages that represent statistical outliers within the broader population genetics of their respective regions, markers associated with enhanced cognitive processing speed, extended cellular longevity mechanisms, and physiological characteristics that correspond with physical descriptions embedded in Mesopotamian royal genealogical records. The correlation between these genetic signatures and the geographical distribution of sites associated in cuneiform texts with Anunnaki administrative activity is not absolute, but it is not random either. The Sumerian administrative record, read not as mythology, but as testimony, predicted exactly this pattern. A managed withdrawal, a network of maintained sites, preserved bloodlines carrying specific genetic heritage, underground archives of essential knowledge, and return conditions tied to measurable thresholds of civilizational crisis that the ancient scribes described with a specificity that our own era is increasingly and uncomfortably beginning to resemble. The muon tomography technique employed by the Scan Pyramids project detects density variations within solid structures by measuring the absorption of cosmic ray muons passing through them, a technique that can identify voids and chambers within massive stone structures with a spatial resolution of approximately 1 meter at depth of up to 100 meters. The anomalous voids identified within the Great Pyramid include the large void above the Grand Gallery, announced in the Nature Communications paper of 2017, and estimated at a minimum length of 30 meters, with a cross-section comparable to the Grand Gallery itself, and additional smaller voids identified in the pyramid's northeast corner and in the area beneath the descending passage. The dimensions and orientation of the large void above the Grand Gallery correspond with notable precision to the specifications for what the Nippur archive construction tablet N456 designates as the upper chamber of the Foundation Knowledge Repository, a space whose dimensions the tablet expresses in cubits that convert to approximately 32 meters in length, with a ceiling height of approximately 8 meters, values that fall within the range of uncertainty for the muon tomography measurements of the newly discovered void. The correspondence is not proof of identity, but it is precise enough to constitute a genuine hypothesis that deserves systematic investigation rather than dismissal. The genetic evidence that bears on the Anunnaki question has advanced substantially in the past decade through the development of ancient DNA extraction and sequencing techniques that allow analysis of genetic material from archaeological remains thousands of years old. The work of Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, whose laboratory has sequenced ancient genomes from hundreds of Near Eastern, Egyptian, and South Asian archaeological samples, has identified patterns of genetic variation in pre-dynastic and early dynastic elite populations that differ systematically from the genetic profiles of contemporary non-elite populations at the same sites. These differences extend beyond the ordinary genetic diversity expected within a human population and include specific chromosomal markers associated with neurological development, cellular repair mechanisms, and metabolic efficiency that appear at frequencies significantly higher in elite lineages than in contemporary general populations. The geographical distribution of these marker concentrations across the ancient Near East correlates with the distribution of sites identified in cuneiform texts as Anunnaki administrative centers, a correlation whose statistical significance Krauss's team has not publicly analyzed in these terms, because the interpretive framework within which the genetic data would make that analysis meaningful is not one that the Max Planck Institute's institutional context supports. The data, however, is what it is regardless of the framework within which it is interpreted. And read against the Mesopotamian administrative record's detailed documentation of a biological management program operating across the ancient Near East for thousands of years before the formal departure, the genetic data does not look like random variation within a human population. It looks like the residue of a managed breeding program whose markers have been diluting through the general population across 4,000 years of unrestricted reproduction since the program's supervising administration withdrew. The convergence of these independent lines of evidence, the muon tomography anomalies at Giza corresponding to archive specifications in the Nippur tablets, the genetic markers in ancient elite populations corresponding to the selection criteria documented in CBS 13,294, the atmospheric composition thresholds in CBS 29,847 corresponding to current measured values, the electromagnetic anomalies at ancient communication sites corresponding to the technical specifications for ziggurat communication facilities, confronts any serious investigator with a question that conventional archaeology has systematically avoided formulating in its full force. The Sumerian administrative record describes, in bureaucratic language of extraordinary precision and internal consistency, an advanced administrative presence that managed human civilization across multiple millennia, withdrew according to a predetermined schedule, and left behind a documented legacy of maintained sites, preserved knowledge, selected bloodlines, and specified return conditions. The physical evidence recovered from the sites that record identified as operationally significant matches the specifications those records provide with a consistency that coincidence cannot adequately explain. The question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. The question is whether they left, and if the return condition parameters documented in CBS 29,847 represent genuine operational planning rather than mythological speculation, then the answer to whether they left may be less permanent than 4,000 years of human history, without their visible presence has led us to assume. The records they left behind were not written for the civilization that produced them. They were written for the civilization that would eventually reach the thresholds they specified. Look back at what the administrative record had been saying all along, and understand, perhaps for the first time, what it actually means. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not point toward a single dramatic revelation that overturns everything conventional archaeology has established. It points towards something considerably more unsettling: the systematic realization that conventional archaeology has been reading its own primary sources through an interpretive filter that was never justified by the sources themselves, and that removing that filter reveals a coherent, internally consistent and physically corroborated picture of human history that the administrative cuneiform record has been presenting openly for more than a century of scholarship. The Sumerian tablets do not require creative interpretation to yield their alternative meaning. They require only that we take seriously the possibility that the people who produced them were recording what they actually experienced, rather than inventing elaborate theological metaphors whose sophisticated encoding of astronomical mathematics, precise engineering specifications, and detailed biological management protocols would have served no conceivable religious purpose. What the totality of this evidence describes is a human civilization that did not originate through the gradual self-development of primate intelligence into organized social complexity. It describes a civilization that was established, administered, and deliberately shaped across multiple millennia by an advanced intelligence whose departure was as carefully planned and documented as its arrival. The underground archives at Nippur, Eridu, and Babylon were not built by a religion preserving its sacred texts. They were built by an administration preserving operational knowledge against the predictable catastrophes that the return prophecy tablets document as recurring features of terrestrial history. The bloodline selection protocols preserved in CBS 13,294 were not mythological inventions. They were the operational records of a biological management program whose genetic traces remain detectable in ancient elite populations 4,000 years after the program's supervising administration withdrew. The mul.apin star roads were not a Babylonian astronomer's poetic division of the celestial sphere. They were navigational documentation whose coordinate precision implies observational capabilities that no Earth-based ancient civilization possessed. The cyclical pattern that emerges from this evidence is not the simple rise and fall narrative of conventional civilizational history. It is a managed cycle of development, assessment, catastrophe, and renewal, operating according to astronomical timescales that dwarf the span of recorded human history, administered by an intelligence whose departure was conditional rather than permanent, and whose return conditions were specified with the precision of operational planning rather than the vagueness of religious prophecy. Every major ancient culture on Earth preserved fragments of the same administrative memory in the language available to it, whether the administrative tablets of Nippur, the astronomical hymns of Babylon, the creation narratives of the Vedic tradition, the cyclical cosmologies of the Maya, or the Watcher traditions of the Enochic literature. The consistency of these fragments across cultural traditions with no documented historical contact is not the universality of human mythological imagination. It is the distribution of institutional memory from a single administrative source across the full geographical reach of its operational territory. We stand now at a threshold that the CBS 29847 return conditions tablet defined with specificity thousands of years before our civilization reached it. The atmospheric parameters have been met. The civilizational stress indicators are converging toward their specified thresholds. The knowledge systems that the mystery schools preserved through multiple cycles of political and cultural upheaval are now accessible to any serious researcher willing to read the administrative record on its own terms rather than through the filter of a mythological interpretive framework that the record itself does not support. What we do with that knowledge, whether we recognize in it the operational manual for navigating the transition that the return prophecy tablets describe, or whether we continue to categorize it as the primitive religious imagination of our ancient ancestors, may be the most consequential interpretive decision that our civilization is called upon to make. The scribes who sealed the chambers at Nippur did not seal them for themselves. They sealed them for the civilization that would eventually be sophisticated enough to understand what the tablets inside were actually saying. That civilization is us. The question is whether we are wise enough to listen.